On the exact day we buried my father, I kept a massive secret. I said absolutely nothing about the $37 million inheritance my dad had quietly secured for me. I kept my mouth shut about the commercial skyscraper sitting right in downtown Los Angeles that I had just purchased under my own name. So when my stepmother stood in front of all the funeral guests and screamed at me to pack my bags because I was not staying in her house, I did not cry or beg. I simply said, okay. What she did not know was that my silence was the beginning of her absolute ruin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who thought they broke you. I am Kendra. I am 35 years old and a commercial real estate developer. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, as the only daughter of Jeremiah, a man who built a highly successful logistics empire completely from scratch. He was brilliant, hardworking, and my absolute biggest supporter. But his one fatal flaw was marrying Valerie. She was a woman utterly obsessed with high society designer labels and making sure everyone in Atlanta knew she had money. When my father passed away suddenly, my entire world shattered. I booked the first flight from Los Angeles back to Atlanta, devastated that I had lost the only person in my family who genuinely loved and understood me. The day of the funeral was a blur of exhausting pleasantries and fake sympathy. Valerie turned my father's repast into a high society networking event. My childhood home, a sprawling brick estate in Buckhead, was packed with local politicians, business partners, and country club acquaintances. The heavy scent of expensive catered food mixed with the suffocating humidity of the Georgia afternoon. The caterers were still clearing the fine china and crystal glasses from the dining room tables when Valerie decided she could not wait another minute to assert her dominance over me. I was standing near the grand staircase, emotionally drained, and holding a cup of black coffee. I was desperately trying to find a quiet moment to process the fact that my dad was really gone. Without warning, Valerie marched across the hardwood floor, her designer heels clicking sharply against the wood. She did not offer comfort or a motherly embrace. Instead, she threw two heavy-duty black contractor trash bags directly at my feet. The thick plastic landed with a dull slap against the floorboards, a sound loud enough to make several guests stop talking and turn to stare. "You are leaving today," Valerie hissed, making sure her voice carried through the foyer. She told me to pack my bags immediately, declaring that I was not staying in her house for another night because I simply did not belong there anymore. I slowly looked up from the trash bags and took in the scene. Standing right behind Valerie was her biological daughter and my stepsister, Jada. Jada was 32 years old, wearing a sleek black designer dress that looked much more suited for an upscale cocktail party than a funeral gathering. She was casually sipping red wine from a crystal goblet, looking completely bored and inconvenienced by my grief. Leaning against the doorframe next to her was Jada's husband, Preston. He was a white finance guy who had married into our family purely for the money and the social connections. Preston was smirking at me, his arms crossed over his tailored suit, clearly enjoying the public spectacle Valerie was creating at my expense. Everyone in the foyer went dead silent. Aunts, uncles, and my dad's old business partners watched with wide eyes, holding their breath. They expected me to break down. They expected me to drop to my knees and beg for a few more days to mourn. They thought I would cry about losing my father or scream back at the woman who had made my life miserable since I was a teenager. Valerie stood there with her chin raised, waiting for my reaction. She wanted a bitter fight, so she could paint me as the unstable, dramatic stepdaughter who ruined her beloved husband's memorial service. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I took a slow, deep breath, absorbing the sheer cruelty of a woman throwing a grieving daughter out with garbage bags on the very day they put her father in the ground. I bent down, picked up the black plastic bags, and folded them neatly over my arm. I looked Valerie dead in the eye, keeping my posture straight and my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any emotion. "Okay," I told her simply. Valerie blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off balance by my calm acceptance. She had prepared for a war, not compliance. Jada actually stopped sipping her wine, her perfectly arched brow furrowing in confusion. I turned my back on them and walked steadily up the sweeping staircase to the guest room I had been staying in. I did not slam the door. I did not throw things in a fit of rage. I methodically packed my few overnight items into my leather duffel bag, making sure not to leave a single trace of myself behind. I left the black trash bags perfectly folded on the pristine white duvet cover. It was a silent message that I did not need her garbage bags or her cruel charity. As I zipped up my bag, I looked around the room one last time. This house held so many beautiful memories of my father. I remembered his loud, booming laugh echoing through the halls. I remembered his invaluable advice during late-night study sessions and the way he always pushed me to build my own empire so I would never have to rely on anyone else's table. He knew exactly how toxic Valerie and Jada were. He knew they viewed his hard-earned wealth as nothing more than an endless personal bank account to fund their lavish lifestyles. And he knew that the moment he was gone, they would bare their fangs and try to strip me of everything. I grabbed my duffel bag and walked back down the stairs with my head held high. The foyer was still thick with tension, the remaining guests awkwardly pretending to look at their phones or their drinks, while covertly watching my exit. Valerie was standing exactly where I left her, still flanked by Jada and Preston like a pair of smug bodyguards. They stood tall, believing they had won the ultimate victory. They thought they had finally pushed the unwanted stepdaughter out of the picture for good, leaving them completely free to drain my father's massive logistics company dry. I walked right past Valerie without sparing a single glance in her direction. I did not owe her an explanation, a tear, or a goodbye. My father was no longer here to keep the peace, and I had absolutely no intention of pretending these toxic people were my family for one more second. I kept my eyes fixed on the heavy oak double doors at the end of the foyer, my leather duffel bag gripped firmly in my hand. The path to the exit was clear for exactly 3 seconds. Then Preston stepped deliberately into my line of sight, crossing his arms and planting his expensive leather loafers squarely in front of the door. Preston was the kind of man who wore his entitlement like cologne. He had married Jada 3 years ago, bringing nothing to the table but a mediocre finance degree and an endless supply of unearned confidence. He viewed my father's wealth as his personal lottery ticket, and he viewed me as an inconvenient obstacle. Now with Jeremiah gone, Preston clearly felt it was his time to assert dominance. He tilted his head, putting on a fake sympathetic pout that made my stomach turn. "You know, Kendra, it really is a shame you could not keep it together for one afternoon, but I suppose impulse control was never your strong suit." I stopped a few feet away from him. I did not drop my bag. I did not offer a reaction. Preston reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a silver money clip. He peeled off a crisp $20 bill, deliberately crumpled it in his fist, and tossed it onto the hardwood floor right at the toes of my boots. "Take an Uber," he said, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "The driveway is reserved for family cars now. We need the space for people who actually belong here." Jada stepped up beside him, swirling the dark red wine in her crystal glass. She sighed heavily, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. "Honestly, Kendra, it is for the best that you leave right now. Your whole somber energy is completely ruining the aesthetic of this repast. I spent weeks curating the floral arrangements and selecting the caterers to honor Daddy properly. You are just standing around bringing the entire vibe down. It is exhausting to look at." Preston chuckled, sliding his arm around Jada's waist and pulling her close. "Let her go back to the West Coast, babe. She has those little California dreams to chase." He looked back at me, his pale eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "How is that going, by the way, still handing out business cards at coffee shops, selling 2-bedroom condos to aspiring actors?" He laughed, a harsh and grating sound that echoed in the quiet foyer. "I never understood your desperate need to be so difficult, Kendra. You were handed a silver spoon, and instead of playing along, you ran off to Los Angeles to play the struggling, independent black woman trope. It is incredibly cliché. You could have stayed here in Atlanta, attended the country club galas with Valerie, and let the adults handle the real money. But you always had this massive chip on your shoulder, this desperate need to prove you could hustle in the real estate market." He practically spat the word hustle, loading it with every racial and classist microaggression he could muster, without saying the quiet part out loud. Now look at you, Preston continued, gesturing broadly around the grand foyer. I am stepping up to run Jeremiah's logistics empire. Jada and Valerie are secure, and you are flying back to Los Angeles with nothing to show for your life but a duffel bag and a bruised ego. You threw your life away, Kendra, and for what? To pretend you do not need us. Jada took a delicate sip of her wine, nodding in agreement. We tried to tell her Preston, but she always thought she was too good for Atlanta high society. She thought she was too good for our family. Now look at her, 35, struggling and getting kicked out of our house on the day of the funeral. I looked from Jada's smug face to Preston's arrogant grin. They really believed their own narrative. In their narrow, status-obsessed minds, I was just a failed real estate agent scraping by on the West Coast, bitter that I had been cut out of the family dynasty. They thought my silence was the silence of defeat. They had absolutely no idea that I spent my days negotiating commercial land acquisitions that dwarfed their entire net worth. They did not know that the hustle Preston was mocking had resulted in a portfolio of high-rise developments across the Pacific coastline. They thought they had just inherited the keys to a kingdom, entirely unaware that Jeremiah had quietly handed them a hollow, decaying shell of a company. I looked down at the crumpled $20 bill resting against the leather of my boot. I knew exactly what Preston wanted. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to curse at him, to lose my temper, to give him a reason to call security and play the civilized victim for the remaining guests. He wanted to break me. Instead, I shifted my weight, lifted my foot, and stepped directly over the crumpled money. I reached out, grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door, and pulled it open. The thick, humid Atlanta summer air immediately rushed into the air-conditioned foyer, carrying the scent of impending rain and wet pavement. I paused on the threshold. I did not turn around to look at them, refusing to give them the satisfaction of my attention. I just let a small, genuine smile touch the corners of my mouth. "Enjoy the house, Jada," I said softly, keeping my voice steady, cold, and perfectly clear. "And Preston, try not to spend that $20 all in one place. You are going to need it very soon." Before he could process the threat hidden in my words, I stepped out onto the expansive brick front porch and let the heavy oak door click firmly shut behind me. The humid Georgia air clung to my skin as I walked down the long, manicured driveway. The gravel crunched steadily beneath my boots. A sleek black town car sat idling near the massive wrought iron gates sent specifically by my legal team. The driver, a quiet professional named Thomas, opened the rear door for me without a word. I slid into the plush leather seat and let out a long, measured breath. As the car pulled away from the sprawling estate, the heavy, stoic mask I had worn for the past 48 hours finally cracked. But I did not dissolve into tears. I did not mourn the family I never truly had. Instead, my mind sharpened into a cold, lethal focus. My father was gone, but his final protective measures were about to ignite. I pulled my phone from my bag and dialed the only number that mattered right now. The line rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. Elias was my father's oldest mentee and currently one of the most ruthless corporate attorneys in Atlanta. He was a brilliant African-American man who had known my father since his early days building the logistics company. More importantly, Elias knew exactly how treacherous Valerie and her golden child were. He had spent years helping my dad build a financial fortress, completely invisible to his money-hungry wife. "Tell me it is done," I said, skipping any polite greetings. "I am sorry about today, Kendra," Elias replied, his voice heavy with genuine sympathy. "Jeremiah deserved a better send-off than whatever circus Valerie just threw. But to answer your question, yes, it is done. Every single document is locked down and secured." I leaned back against the headrest, watching the Atlanta suburbs blur past the tinted windows. Did they suspect anything at the repast? Not a thing, Elias chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. Preston has been strutting around my office all week demanding access to the corporate accounts. Valerie is already trying to schedule meetings with the board of directors to assert her dominance. They genuinely believe they just inherited the entire logistics empire. Let them believe it, I told him, staring out at the passing trees. Let them sit on the throne for a little while. Elias cleared his throat, the sound shifting the conversation back to strict business. I initiated the final transfers the moment you gave the signal this morning. The $37 million offshore trust your father established for you is now completely activated. It is airtight, Kendra. Valerie could hire every estate lawyer in the state of Georgia, and they would not be able to pierce the veil on this trust. It is entirely in your name, untraceable from the primary estate, and completely legally insulated. A profound sense of gratitude washed over me, mixing with the sharp sting of missing my dad. He had known. He had always known that the moment his heart stopped beating, Valerie would try to leave me with absolutely nothing. He had spent the last 5 years quietly liquidating his most valuable private assets, funneling the cash into a blind trust that Valerie knew absolutely nothing about. He left her the loud, flashy logistics company, the one with his name on the building, the one she loved to brag about at her country club dinners. But he gave me the actual wealth. And the Los Angeles acquisition, I asked, shifting my focus to the future. Signed, sealed, and delivered. Elias confirmed the pride evident in his tone. The seller accepted your final terms late last night. The commercial skyscraper in downtown Los Angeles is officially yours. The deed is recorded under your holding company. You are now the sole owner of a prime piece of the West Coast skyline. I closed my eyes and let the reality of those words sink into my bones. Preston had just mocked me for selling 2-bedroom condos to struggling actors. He had laughed in my face, calling my career a cliché, completely unaware that the daughter he was trying to humiliate had just closed a multi-million-dollar solo acquisition that would make his entire finance firm look like a child's lemonade stand. They handed me 2 trash bags, Elias, I said quietly, the memory of Valerie's smug face flashing in my mind. Preston threw a $20 bill at my feet and told me to take an Uber. Elias let out a low, dangerous breath. They really have no idea who they are dealing with, do they? No, I replied, a cold smile forming on my lips. They do not. And we are going to keep it that way. I want you to proceed exactly as we planned. When you read the will next week, you give them exactly what they expect to hear. You give them the logistics company. You give them the house. You give them the illusion of absolute victory. Are you absolutely sure about this? Kendra Elias asked, playing the devil's advocate just to be certain. If I read that dummy will, they are going to take complete control of the company operations. Preston is arrogant enough to think he can run it, but he is going to drive it straight into the ground. That is exactly what I am counting on. I explained, my voice steady and unwavering. My father showed me the real financial ledgers last month. The logistics company is a hollow shell. Valerie has been bleeding the operating accounts dry for years to fund her designer shopping sprees and Jada's lavish lifestyle. The company is leveraged to the hilt with toxic debt. It is a sinking ship, and Preston is fighting for the right to be the captain. So we let them drown, Elias stated, understanding the assignment perfectly. We let them think they are sailing, I corrected him. We let them take out more loans. We let them sign personal guarantees. We let Preston inflate his chest and act like a titan of industry. Block any early warning notices from the banks if you can. Delay the collection calls. Let them burn through whatever remaining credit lines they can scramble together. I want them to throw away cash on luxury cars and country club fees while I fly back to California and quietly build my empire. It is a brilliant trap, Elias murmured. When the debt finally comes due, they will not have a single life vest. Exactly, I said, opening my eyes and looking at the driver in the front seat. Thomas, take me straight to the airport. I have a flight to catch. Right away, Ms. Kendra Thomas replied respectfully, merging onto the highway. I brought the phone back to my ear. Elias, I will see you at the formal will reading next week. Until then, play the part of the reluctant, defeated lawyer. Let Valerie gloat. The silent game begins today. I will have the documents ready, Elias promised. Have a safe flight back to Los Angeles, Kendra. And for what it is worth, your father would be incredibly proud of how you are handling this. Thank you, Elias, I whispered. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my bag. I looked out the window as the Atlanta skyline faded into the distance. My father was gone, but his legacy was safe with me. I was not the broken, discarded stepdaughter they desperately wanted me to be. I was a commercial real estate mogul holding the keys to a $37 million war chest, and I was going to let Valerie, Jada, and Preston build their own spectacular gallows. Exactly 7 days later, I stepped out of a rented SUV and into the suffocating humidity of an Atlanta summer afternoon. I smoothed the skirt of my tailored black sheath dress, adjusted my dark sunglasses, and walked through the revolving glass doors of the most prestigious law firm in Buckhead. It was time for the formal reading of my father's will. I knew exactly what I was walking into. Valerie had orchestrated this entire afternoon to be a grand theatrical performance. When I entered the expansive mahogany-paneled boardroom, I saw that she had not just invited the immediate family. She had packed the room with every nosy church auntie, extended cousin, and high society acquaintance she could find. She wanted a massive audience to witness my ultimate humiliation. Valerie sat at the center of the massive table wearing a custom black morning suit and a diamond tennis necklace that easily cost $50,000. She was dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Next to her sat Jada, scrolling through her phone with an air of complete boredom, and Preston, who was already wearing a platinum watch that I recognized from my father's personal collection. They looked like royalty waiting for their coronation. Elias sat at the head of the table. When our eyes met, he gave a barely perceptible nod. He was a master of his craft, and today his role was to play the defeated, reluctant attorney forced to deliver terrible news to his mentor's only child. Elias cleared his throat and opened the thick leather-bound folder. The room went dead silent. The heavy scent of expensive perfume and nervous sweat hung in the air. He read the legal jargon methodically, building the tension exactly as my father had designed it. He announced that the sprawling estate in Buckhead, the luxury vehicles, and the entirety of the logistics company were to be transferred immediately to Valerie. He read out the clauses giving Preston executive control over the commercial assets. The audience murmured in approval. Valerie let out a loud, dramatic sigh, placing a hand over her heart, as if she were overwhelmed by her late husband's generosity. Then Elias turned this page. His voice dropped, taking on a heavy, somber tone. To my only daughter, Kendra, he read aloud, I leave the sum of $5,000 to be used for relocation and moving expenses as she continues to find her path on the West Coast. A collective gasp echoed through the boardroom. Aunt Beatrice, sitting near the back, actually dropped her hand fan. Whispers erupted instantly. $5,000 was not an inheritance. It was a calculated insult. It was a tip. It was the absolute dismissal of my existence. Valerie looked across the table at me, her eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. She leaned forward, placing her manicured hand over mine. I know this must be so hard for you to hear, Kendra, she said, projecting her voice so every single person in the room could catch her fake sympathy. But your father knew you struggled to hold down a stable life. He knew you were just bouncing around California. He wanted to protect the family legacy. I promise we will make sure you get a nice coach ticket back to Los Angeles. Everyone watched me. They waited for the explosion. They waited for me to flip the heavy mahogany table, to scream that it was fraud, to cry hysterically, and beg the lawyer to check the documents again. They wanted the angry black woman stereotype served up on a silver platter so they could whisper about my lack of class at their Sunday dinners. I did not give them a single drop of satisfaction. I gently slid my hand out from under Valerie's grasp. I looked at Elias and extended my right hand. Pass me the pen, Elias, I said, my voice perfectly steady and clear. Elias handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. Without a single moment of hesitation, I flipped to the signature page of the acknowledgement packet. I signed my name in smooth, bold strokes, legally accepting the $5,000 and waiving my right to contest the dummy will. I placed the pen down, closed the folder, and pushed it back toward Elias. Thank you, Elias, I said. And thank you, Valerie. I appreciate the travel funds. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Valerie blinked, her triumphant smile faltering. Jada finally looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. I stood up, smoothed my dress, and walked out of the boardroom with my head held high. I left a room full of people utterly paralyzed by my lack of reaction. The Georgia heat hit me like a physical wall as I walked into the concrete parking garage. I was 2 steps away from my rental car when a voice echoed behind me, playing it cool until the very end. I have to admit, Kendra, you are a decent actress. I turned around. Preston was strolling toward me, jingling the keys to his newly leased luxury sedan. He leaned against the hood of my rental car, physically blocking my path to the driver's side door. His arrogant smirk made my skin crawl. "Tough break in there," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "But honestly, it is for the best. You do not have the business acumen to run a logistics empire anyway. It takes a certain pedigree to handle multi-million-dollar corporate accounts." I simply stared at him, letting him dig his own grave. "But I am a generous guy." Preston continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "Jada and I are launching a new luxury real estate holding company next month using the capital from the estate. We need to hit some corporate quotas. I am willing to offer you a position as a diversity consultant. It is a remote role. You can stay out in Los Angeles, take a few Zoom calls, and put a legitimate title on your resume for when you go back to hustling 2-bedroom condos." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening whisper. "But let us get one thing straight. You do not use your father's last name in any of your little real estate ventures out west. We own the legacy now. We own the brand. We cannot have you tarnishing the corporate image with whatever urban hustle you are running out there. Take the $5,000. Take the diversity consultant title. Keep your head down and stay out of our way." I looked at his expensive leather shoes. I looked at the stolen watch on his wrist. I looked at the sheer, unearned audacity radiating from his pale eyes. He truly believed he had just conquered the world. I reached up and slowly adjusted my dark sunglasses. I gave him a brilliant, razor-sharp smile. "I look forward to seeing your new office, Preston," I said softly. "Make sure you sign a long lease." I stepped around him, unlocked my car, and drove away, leaving him standing in the humid parking garage with a confused scowl on his face. 6 hours later, I was breathing the crisp, dry air of Southern California. I stepped out of the private elevator and into my minimalist penthouse office overlooking the Los Angeles skyline. The stark contrast between the toxic, suffocating environment of Atlanta and the sleek, quiet power of my own empire always grounded me. A man in a sharp gray suit was already waiting for me at my glass conference table. It was David, the federal trust auditor and the actual legally binding executor of my father's true estate. "Welcome back, Ms. Kendra," David said, standing up respectfully as I entered the room. "I assume the theatrical performance in Atlanta went according to plan." "They took the bait," I confirmed, tossing my bag onto the sofa and taking a seat across from him. "They signed everything. Valerie and Preston believe they have absolute control of the logistics company." David offered a grim, knowing smile and slid a thick stack of financial dossiers across the glass table. "Then they just signed their own financial death warrants." I opened the dossier. The numbers were staggering. My father had shown me the real ledgers before he passed, but seeing the updated federal audit made the reality even sweeter. The logistics company was a complete illusion. Valerie had spent the last 5 years taking out shadow loans and bleeding the operating accounts dry to fund her relentless need for status. She had mortgaged the company equipment, taken out toxic high-interest loans against the commercial properties, and completely drained the cash reserves. "The company they just inherited is currently $15 million in the red," David explained, tapping a specific line on the financial report. "Your father legally funneled every single clean liquid asset into your blind trust before the debt accrued. The $37 million sitting in your offshore accounts is untouchable. Meanwhile, Preston is currently listed as the primary executive officer of the logistics firm. By the end of business today, he will be personally required to guarantee those toxic loans to keep the lights on." I stared at the paperwork, tracing the massive negative balances with my fingertip. Preston wanted a corporate empire to play with. He wanted to feel like a titan of industry. To keep up the facade of his new luxury real estate firm, He would have to sign his own name on those failing loans. He would legally bind himself to Valerie's reckless debt. Do not send them any warnings. I instructed David, closing the dossier. Do not let the bank notify them of the default status just yet. Let Preston sign the personal guarantees. Let him transfer the remaining fumes of credit into his new holding company. Let them throw their massive launch parties and buy their new mansions. Let them climb as high as they possibly can. David nodded, gathering the documents and returning them to his briefcase. The higher they climb, the harder the impact when the foundation shatters. I will instruct the legal team to maintain the blackout. The bank will not call in the debt until the end of the fiscal quarter. Perfect, I whispered, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below. They thought they had buried me in Atlanta with 2 trash bags and a crumpled $20 bill. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the match to burn their entire world to the ground. 7 days later, the dense Georgia heat wrapped around me the second I stepped out of my rented SUV in Buckhead. I smoothed the skirt of my tailored black sheath dress, adjusted my dark sunglasses, and walked through the heavy revolving glass doors of the most prestigious law firm in the city. It was time for the formal reading of my father's will. I knew exactly what I was walking into. Valerie had orchestrated this entire afternoon to be a grand theatrical performance. When the receptionist escorted me into the expansive mahogany-paneled boardroom, I saw that my stepmother had not just invited the immediate family. She had packed the room with every nosy church auntie, extended cousin, and high society acquaintance she could find. She wanted a massive audience to witness my ultimate humiliation. Valerie sat at the center of the massive conference table, wearing a custom black morning suit. Around her neck rested a diamond tennis necklace that easily cost $50,000. She was dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. Next to her sat Jada, scrolling through her phone with an air of complete boredom, clearly annoyed that she had to be present for legal formalities. On Jada's right was Preston. He was already wearing a vintage platinum watch that I immediately recognized from my father's personal collection. Preston leaned back in his leather executive chair, looking like a king waiting for his coronation. Elias sat near the head of the table. When our eyes met, he gave a barely perceptible nod. He was a master of his craft, and today his role was to play the defeated, reluctant attorney forced to hand over his mentor's legacy to vultures. But Valerie, never one to leave things to chance, had brought her own legal muscle. A slick, over-tanned attorney named Sterling stood beside her, brought in specifically to oversee the execution of the documents and ensure Elias did not try any last-minute maneuvers. Sterling cleared his throat and opened a thick leather-bound folder. The room went dead silent. The heavy scent of expensive floral perfume and nervous anticipation hung in the air. He began reading the legal jargon methodically, his voice booming across the long table. He announced that the sprawling estate in Buckhead, the fleet of luxury vehicles, and the entirety of the logistics company were to be transferred immediately to Valerie. Furthermore, he read out specific clauses granting Preston executive control over all commercial assets and daily corporate operations. The audience murmured in approval. A few aunts nodded respectfully. Valerie let out a loud, dramatic sigh, placing a hand over her heart, as if she were completely overwhelmed by her late husband's boundless generosity. Preston smirked, adjusting his suit jacket, already mentally spending the millions he thought he just acquired. Then Sterling turned the page. He paused, looking over the rim of his reading glasses directly at me. His voice dropped, taking on a heavy, somber tone designed for maximum dramatic effect. To my only biological daughter, Kendra Sterling read aloud, I leave the sum of $5,000 to be used for relocation and moving expenses as she continues to find her path on the West Coast. A collective gasp echoed through the boardroom. Aunt Beatrice, sitting near the back row of leather chairs, actually dropped her hand fan. Whispers erupted instantly, buzzing like angry hornets. $5,000 was not an inheritance. It was a calculated insult. It was a tip. It was the absolute, undeniable dismissal of my existence. Valerie looked across the table at me, her eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. She had clearly forced my father to draft this specific outdated version of the will years ago during one of his vulnerable health scares, and Sterling had resurrected it for today. She leaned forward, placing her manicured hand flat on the mahogany table. "I know this must be so hard for you to hear," Kendra Valerie said, projecting her voice so every single person in the room could catch her fake, syrupy sympathy. "But your father knew you struggled to hold down a stable life. He knew you were just bouncing around California chasing pipe dreams. He wanted to protect the family legacy from poor investments. I promise we will make sure you get a nice coach ticket back to Los Angeles so you can get back on your feet." Everyone watched me. The entire room held its collective breath. They waited for the explosion. They waited for me to flip the heavy mahogany table, to scream that this was fraud, to cry hysterically, and to beg the lawyers to check the documents again. They wanted the angry, unhinged black woman stereotype served up on a silver platter so they could whisper about my lack of class at their Sunday dinners for the next decade. They wanted a show. I did not give them a single drop of satisfaction. I sat perfectly still, my posture straight, and my expression completely unreadable. I looked at Elias, who sat quietly with his hands folded, playing his part flawlessly. Then I looked at Sterling, who was holding out a stack of acknowledgement papers, expecting a grueling legal battle. I stood up smoothly, the fabric of my dress rustling in the quiet room. I walked over to Sterling, reaching out my right hand. "Pass me the pen," I said, my voice perfectly steady, cold and clear. Sterling blinked, clearly thrown off guard by my compliance. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing me a heavy gold fountain pen. Without a single moment of hesitation, I flipped to the signature page of the acknowledgement packet. I signed my name in smooth, bold strokes, legally accepting the $5,000 and officially waiving my right to contest the fraudulent will. I placed the pen down with a soft click, closed the folder, and pushed it back toward Sterling. "Thank you, gentlemen," I said, looking from Sterling to Elias. "And thank you, Valerie. I appreciate the travel funds. Every little bit helps." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. Valerie blinked rapidly, her triumphant smile faltering as confusion washed over her features. She had wanted to break me, but my total surrender felt wrong to her. Jada finally looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed, realizing that my reaction did not match the devastation she had anticipated. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his stolen watch. I smoothed my dress, picked up my designer handbag, and walked out of the boardroom with my head held high. I did not rush. I did not look back. I left a room full of people, utterly paralyzed by my lack of reaction, completely unaware that my signature on that paper was the final lock snapping shut on their financial tomb. The heavy revolving doors of the law firm clicked shut behind me, sealing away the circus of my step-family and their audience. The relentless Georgia heat hit me instantly, a thick blanket of humidity that smelled of melting asphalt and impending rain. I walked with measured steps across the concrete expanse of the VIP parking garage. The hollow echo of my heels striking the pavement was the only sound. I felt no grief over the $5,000 check. I felt only the icy thrill of a predator watching its prey step directly into a snare. I reached into my designer handbag, my fingers brushing against the keys to my rental SUV. I pressed the unlock button. The headlights flashed in the dim garage. Before my hand could even touch the driver's side door handle, a shadow stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, playing the stoic martyr until the very bitter end. "I have to admit, Kendra, you possess a remarkable poker face." I stopped. I did not flinch. I slowly turned my head. Preston was strolling toward me at a leisurely pace. He was jingling the keys to his newly leased European sports car in his right hand. He wore a smug, victorious grin that stretched perfectly across his face. He stepped directly into my personal space and leaned his weight casually against the driver's side door of my rental car, physically blocking my path. He crossed his arms over his tailored suit jacket, bringing my father's vintage platinum watch into plain view on his wrist. The absolute disrespect of seeing that timepiece on him almost made me laugh. He looked like a little boy playing dress-up in a giant's closet. "Tough break in that boardroom," Preston said, his voice dripping with artificial sympathy. But honestly, it is for the best. You simply do not possess the business acumen required to run a logistics empire of this magnitude. It takes a certain pedigree, a specific type of aggressive vision to handle multi-million-dollar corporate accounts and navigate the elite circles of Atlanta. You have always lacked that particular polish. I stood perfectly still, resting my weight evenly on both feet. I let him talk. I knew that narcissists always revealed their weaknesses when they thought they held the upper hand. Preston took my silence as submission. He took a step closer, towering over me, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. But I am a generous man, Kendra. And despite your constant hostility toward Valerie and Jada, we are not heartless people. We know you are going back to California with nothing but a bruised ego and $5,000. We know how expensive the West Coast is. Jada feels pity for you, and frankly, so do I. He uncrossed his arms and slipped his hands into his pockets, adopting the posture of a benevolent king handing out breadcrumbs to a peasant. Jada and I are launching a new luxury real estate holding company next month. Preston continued, his chest puffing out with unearned pride. We are utilizing the massive capital from the estate to build something sophisticated. We have global investors lined up. We are going to need to hit some corporate diversity quotas to secure certain municipal tax breaks. I am willing to offer you a position as our chief diversity consultant. He paused, clearly waiting for me to look grateful. When I simply stared at him, he chuckled, a harsh and grating sound. It is a remote role, obviously, he said. You can stay safely out in Los Angeles. You log into a few video calls read from a script and put a legitimate high-level corporate title on your resume. It will look much better than whatever urban hustle you are currently running out there. You will finally have a steady paycheck when you go back to peddling two-bedroom condos to struggling actors. I looked at his expensive leather shoes. I looked at the stolen watch on his wrist. I looked at the sheer, blinding audacity radiating from his pale eyes. He truly believed he had just conquered the world. He was a mediocre white man who had married into a wealthy black family, manipulated his way to the front of the line, and was now trying to toss a diversity title at the biological daughter of the empire's founder. The layers of classist and racial microaggressions were so thick you could cut them with a knife. You have always had this massive chip on your shoulder, Kendra, Preston said, his tone darkening when I refused to react. This desperate need to prove you could survive without us. You ran away to play the strong, independent black woman trope, and it is incredibly cliché. You were handed a silver spoon and you spat it out because you could not handle the rules of polite society. Now you are 35, struggling and practically begging for scraps. Take the job. Take the salary. Be smart for once in your life. I still did not speak. I was cataloging every single word, mapping out exactly how much debt this fool was about to drown in. Preston leaned in closer. His breath smelled of stale coffee and expensive mints. His voice dropped into a harsh, threatening whisper, stripping away the last remnants of his fake generosity. But let us get one thing absolutely straight, he said, his eyes narrowing. You do not use your father's last name in any of your little real estate ventures out west. We own the legacy now. We own the brand. We hold the keys to the castle. I will not have you tarnishing our corporate image with whatever cheap hustle you are running in the slums of California. If I catch wind that you are trying to leverage Jeremiah's name to secure loans or clients, I will tie you up in litigation so fast your head will spin. I have the funds to bury you in court fees until you are living on the street. He stepped back, giving me a hard, evaluating look. Take the $5,000. Take the consultant title. Keep your head down, stay out of our way, and be grateful we are allowing you to keep a piece of the pie. The humid air in the parking garage felt heavy and still. I looked at Preston. I saw past the tailored suit and the stolen watch. I saw a man who was about to sign personal guarantees on $15 million of toxic corporate debt. I saw a man who was blindly rushing to take the helm of a sinking ship, convinced he was boarding a luxury yacht. He thought he was giving me an ultimatum. He was actually reading his own financial obituary. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of anger. I reached up slowly with my right hand and adjusted my dark designer sunglasses, sliding them perfectly into place to shield my eyes from the glaring fluorescent lights of the parking garage. I gave him a brilliant, razor-sharp smile. "I look forward to seeing your new office, Preston," I said. My voice was soft, steady, and chillingly polite. I stepped around him with deliberate, measured grace. I reached out, grabbed the handle of my rental car door, and pulled it open. Preston stepped back, his triumphant scowl faltering, slightly replaced by a fleeting shadow of confusion. My absolute lack of fear unsettled him. I slid into the driver's seat, pulled the door shut with a solid thud, and started the engine. I did not look at him again. I put the car in drive and pulled smoothly out of the parking space, leaving Preston standing in the thick, humid air of the concrete garage. He thought he had just won the war. He had absolutely no idea the battlefield belonged to me. 6 hours later, the suffocating humidity of Atlanta was entirely replaced by the crisp, dry air of Southern California. I stepped out of my private elevator and into my minimalist penthouse office overlooking the Los Angeles skyline. The stark contrast between the toxic environment of my step-family and the sleek, quiet power of my own empire always grounded me. The walls were lined with architectural blueprints and commercial zoning permits. This was my sanctuary. I tossed my designer handbag onto the pristine white leather sofa and walked over to my massive glass conference table. A man in a sharp charcoal suit was already waiting for me. This was Donovan. He was a federal trust auditor and the actual legally binding executor of my father's true estate. While Elias handled the public theater back in Georgia, Donovan was the silent architect behind the invisible financial fortress my father had built. "Welcome back to the West Coast," Kendra, Donovan said, standing up respectfully as I entered the room. "I assume the theatrical performance in Atlanta went exactly according to plan." They took the bait completely. I confirmed, taking a seat across from him. They signed everything without a single second of hesitation. Valerie and Preston genuinely believe they have absolute control of the logistics company and the entire estate. Donovan offered a grim, knowing smile. He reached down to his sleek leather briefcase and slid a thick, heavy stack of financial dossiers across the glass table. Then they just signed their own financial death warrants. I opened the dossier. The numbers printed on the crisp white pages were staggering. My father had shown me the real ledgers a few months before he passed, but seeing the updated federal audit made the reality of the situation even sweeter. The logistics company they were so desperate to steal from me was a complete illusion. It was a rotting carcass painted gold. Over the last 5 years, Valerie had spent every waking moment taking out shadow loans and bleeding the operating accounts dry to fund her relentless need for social status. She had secretly mortgaged the company equipment, taken out toxic high-interest loans against the commercial warehouses, and completely drained the cash reserves to pay for Jada's lavish lifestyle and her own designer shopping sprees. My father knew exactly what she was doing. Instead of fighting her on it, he simply let her dig her own grave. He aggressively leveraged the remaining equity, extracted every single clean liquid asset, and legally funneled it all into my blind trust before the massive debt accrued. The company they just inherited is currently $15 million in the red, Donovan explained calmly, tapping a specific line on the financial report with his expensive pen. The $37 million sitting in your offshore accounts is completely legally insulated and untouchable. Meanwhile, Preston is currently listed as the primary executive officer of the logistics firm. He pushed so hard for that title. By the end of business today, he will be personally required to guarantee those toxic loans just to keep the lights on and the payroll funded. I stared at the paperwork, tracing the massive negative balances with my fingertip. Preston wanted a corporate empire to play with. He wanted to feel like a titan of industry. To keep up the facade of his brand new luxury real estate firm, he would have to sign his own name on those failing loans. He would legally bind himself to Valerie's reckless debt. They had fought tooth and nail to inherit a sinking ship. "Do not send them any early warnings," I instructed Donovan, closing the dossier and pushing it back toward him. "Do not let the banks notify them of the critical default status just yet. Let Preston sign those personal guarantees. Let him transfer the remaining fumes of credit into his new holding company. Let them throw their massive launch parties and buy their new mansions. Let them climb as high as they possibly can. Donovan nodded, gathering the documents and securely returning them to his briefcase. The higher they climb, the harder the impact when the foundation shatters. I will instruct the legal team to maintain the blackout. The banks will not call in the debt until the end of the fiscal quarter. Perfect, I whispered, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below. Preston and Jada were probably celebrating at some overpriced Buckhead restaurant right now, popping champagne and toasting to my supposed downfall. They were parading around Atlanta on borrowed millions, completely oblivious to the fact that their bank accounts were a ticking time bomb. They thought they had buried me with 2 trash bags and a crumpled $20 bill. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the match to burn their entire world to the ground. Are you prepared for the fallout when they realize the truth? Donovan asked, adjusting his tie. Because once those loans default, they are going to come looking for a bailout. Valerie will leverage every social connection she has left to try and force your hand. They will comb through every legal loophole to find out where the real money went. Let them look, I said, turning back to face him. The beauty of my father's plan is that the trust was established long before the debt reached critical mass. They cannot touch my funds, and they cannot touch my real estate. When the walls close in on them, they will turn on each other. Preston will blame Valerie for the debt. Valerie will blame Preston for mismanaging the company. And Jada will be caught in the middle of it all crying because her credit cards are getting declined at the country club. Donovan let out a rare, genuine laugh. You are exactly like Jeremiah. He always said you had a strategic mind. I learned from the best. I replied, a small wave of grief briefly touching my heart before I locked it away again. My father spent his last years ensuring I would never be at the mercy of those vultures. I am just seeing his final business transaction through to the end. I walked Donovan to the private elevator, thanking him for his meticulous work. As the silver doors slid shut, I returned to my desk and opened my laptop. It was time to shift my focus back to my own empire. The Los Angeles skyscraper acquisition was demanding my full attention, and I needed to prepare the executive leasing office for the upcoming quarter. I had premium penthouse floors to fill and international investors to secure. While my stepfamily was busy playing dress-up in Atlanta, I was actively shaping the West Coast skyline. I had $37 million of clean capital to deploy and a reputation as one of the most ruthless commercial developers in the city. The silent game was playing out flawlessly. I did not need to lift a single finger to destroy Preston and Valerie. I just needed to stand back and watch them destroy themselves. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my social media feed. Jada had already posted a picture of herself and Preston clinking champagne glasses at an exclusive Atlanta restaurant. The caption read, "Cheers to new beginnings and building the family legacy." I felt a cold smile pull at the corners of my mouth. They were absolutely drunk on power and fake money. I locked my phone and set it face down on my desk. They could have their little victory dinner tonight. Soon enough, I would be flying back to Atlanta for their highly anticipated launch party. And I was going to make sure my presence was the most expensive lesson they ever learned. I picked up my phone from the glass desk and immediately dialed Elias back in Atlanta. The time difference meant he was likely sitting in his dimly lit office reviewing case files over a glass of bourbon, but I knew he would answer on the first ring. "Elias," I said the moment the line connected, "I need you to orchestrate a complete communications blackout on all financial correspondence regarding the logistics company. Do whatever it takes. I do not want Preston or Valerie receiving a single early warning notice from the banks." "I can handle that," Elias replied smoothly, his deep voice carrying a note of dark amusement. "Preston is too arrogant to realize that he has not fully transitioned the corporate legal contacts yet. All the certified mail, the default warnings, and the margin call notices from the creditors are still being routed through my firm as the primary legal shield. I will simply bury them in a filing cabinet. By the time Preston realizes he needs to check the actual mail, he will already be drowning." "Exactly," I said, leaning back in my executive chair. "They are intoxicated by the illusion of power. I want them to drink themselves into a stupor. Tell me what they are doing with the remaining credit lines." Elias let out a heavy sigh that spoke volumes about their sheer financial incompetence. They are completely out of their minds, Kendra. Preston just marched into a luxury dealership this morning and leased 3 brand new vehicles under the company name: a Range Rover for Jada, a Porsche for himself, and a Mercedes SUV for Valerie. He completely bypassed the corporate accountants. Valerie just renewed her Diamond Tier membership at the Buckhead Country Club and wrote a massive check for their upcoming renovation project, claiming it was a charitable donation from your late father's estate to secure her social standing. And the new real estate firm, I asked, shaking my head at their absolute stupidity. Jada is currently bleeding the last operational cash reserves dry to fund the interior design of their new office space, Elias explained. She hired some celebrity decorator to import custom Italian marble and high-end velvet furniture. Preston is running around town taking potential investors to five-star lunches, charging $1,000 wine bottles to the dying logistics company. They are treating a multi-million-dollar corporate deficit like it is an unlimited black card. Let them bleed it dry, I instructed, my voice cold and unwavering. Every single dollar they spend on Italian marble and German sports cars is another nail driven straight into their financial coffin. Do not interfere, Elias. Do not offer advice. Let them throw away cash they do not have. When the fiscal quarter ends, the banks are going to demand their money, and Preston will be left holding a massive empty bag. I will keep the gates locked and the warnings buried, Elias promised. Build your empire, Kendra. I will handle the circus down here. I ended the call and turned my attention back to the sprawling city below my penthouse window. The sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean, casting a brilliant golden glow across the Los Angeles skyline. I did not have time to dwell on the pathetic circus happening in Georgia. I had a monumental task in front of me. I had to integrate my newly acquired skyscraper into my commercial real estate portfolio. The next morning, I stood in the grand lobby of my new building. It was 50 stories of premium commercial real estate, a towering monument of glass structural steel and polished black marble. This was not fake wealth. This was not a leased sports car or a country club membership bought with stolen credit. This was tangible, undeniable power. I spent the next 3 weeks working 14-hour days. I walked the executive floors with my lead architects, mapping out the renovations for the penthouse suites. I met with international tech firms and aggressive venture capital groups who were desperate to secure long-term leases in my building. I reviewed every single contract with surgical precision. I was not spending money to look rich. I was investing capital to become completely untouchable. I funneled a portion of my $37 million trust into upgrading the building's security infrastructure and modernizing the environmental systems. I wanted my skyscraper to be the most coveted commercial address on the West Coast. While Preston and Jada were busy picking out velvet curtains and trying to impress old money socialites in Atlanta, I was sitting in boardrooms with actual billionaires negotiating deals that would secure my financial legacy for the next century. Despite the grueling hours, I made sure to carve out time to monitor my stepfamily's digital footprint. My social media feeds became a continuous, highly entertaining highlight reel of their absolute delusion. Jada posted daily videos of her new Range Rover, complaining about how exhausting it was to be a business owner while getting daytime manicures. Valerie posted carefully curated photos from the country club dining room, wearing expensive new diamonds and making sure to caption the images with hashtags about generational wealth and Southern grace. Preston updated his professional profile obnoxiously, listing himself as the chief executive officer of the logistics empire and the visionary founder of his new luxury real estate group. They were building a magnificent castle entirely out of sand, completely ignorant of the massive tidal wave I was holding back. As the end of the month approached, the air in my Los Angeles office felt thick with anticipation. The trap was perfectly set. The financial blackout had worked flawlessly. The logistics company was teetering on the absolute brink of total default, and Preston had personally guaranteed the corporate loans just as I predicted. The final piece of the puzzle arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. My executive assistant walked into my office and handed me a thick, heavy envelope made of expensive cream-colored cardstock. It was sealed with a gold wax stamp, bearing a custom monogram that Preston and Jada had clearly designed for themselves. I sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. Inside was an overly elaborate, terribly gaudy invitation. Valerie was hosting a grand memorial gala in honor of my late father at one of the most exclusive hotel ballrooms in downtown Atlanta. But the fine print revealed her true intentions. The memorial was just a tasteless smokescreen. The event was actually a highly publicized launch party for Preston and Jada's new luxury real estate firm. They were using my father's death as an excuse to gather the wealthiest investors in the city into one room so Preston could pitch his new company. The absolute disrespect was staggering. They had thrown me out of my childhood home on the day of my father's funeral, and now they were using his memory to fund their fake empire. They had not bothered to invite me, of course. The invitation had been forwarded to me by Elias, who had received one as the former estate attorney. I looked at the gold-embossed lettering, a cold, predatory thrill washing over me. They wanted to throw a high society gala to announce their arrival to the world. They wanted to stand on a stage and pretend they were untouchable royalty. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. "Cancel all my local meetings for next weekend," I told my assistant. "Book me a first-class ticket to Atlanta. And call my personal stylist. Tell her I need a gown. Something understated, elegant, and absolutely devastating." I leaned back in my leather chair and let the invitation drop onto my glass desk. Preston, Jada, and Valerie had spent the last month enjoying the illusion of absolute victory. They had burned through their credit lines, alienated their true allies, and walked blindly into a financial slaughterhouse. Now it was time for me to return to Georgia. It was time to step into their perfect little spotlight and remind them exactly who they were dealing with. The silent game was over. The public reckoning was about to begin. Exactly 1 month later, the warm California breeze was replaced by the suffocating air conditioning of the grandest hotel ballroom in downtown Atlanta. I stood just outside the massive mahogany double doors, handing my velvet coat to the attendant. I did not have an invitation. I did not need one. I walked through the doors and immediately took in the absolute circus Valerie had orchestrated. She had billed this evening to Atlanta high society as a sacred memorial for my father. Yet the massive ice sculptures flanking the buffet tables were carved into the shape of a generic skyline, and the silk banners draped across the walls prominently featured the gold-embossed logo of Preston and Jada's new luxury real estate firm. My father's actual portrait was relegated to a small, poorly lit table near the restrooms. It was not a memorial. It was a hostile corporate takeover disguised as a cocktail party, funded entirely by credit lines that were weeks away from exploding. I had instructed my personal stylist to procure something utterly devastating for this specific occasion. I wore a floor-length backless emerald silk gown. I wore no flashy logos and no heavy distracting jewelry. I wore just a single vintage emerald ring that had belonged to my biological mother. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, flawless chignon. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman in complete control of her own empire. In stark contrast, Valerie and Jada looked like they had robbed a jewelry store blindfolded. As I smoothly navigated past a towering pyramid of champagne glasses, I spotted them holding court near the center of the ballroom. Valerie was squeezed into a sequined silver dress that caught the harsh overhead lights, a massive diamond choker sitting heavily against her collarbone. Jada stood next to her, dripping in thick diamond tennis bracelets and a matching tiara that screamed desperate new money. They were broadcasting their supposed wealth to everyone in the room, blissfully unaware that those stones were purchased with the last drops of blood from a dying company. I did not march over to them. I simply walked to the marble bar, ordered a glass of sparkling water with a twist of lemon, and turned to face the room. It took exactly 4 minutes for the whispers to start. The old money families of Atlanta. The people who had genuinely respected my father and built real businesses alongside him noticed me immediately. They saw the biological daughter, the one who had supposedly been disowned and exiled to California, standing at the bar looking completely unbothered and utterly radiant. The murmurs rippled through the wealthy crowd until they finally reached the center of the room. Valerie's head snapped in my direction. The fake gracious smile she had been flashing to potential investors instantly melted into a mask of pure venom. Jada followed her gaze, her hand instinctively flying up to touch her heavy diamond necklace as if checking to make sure it was still there. Valerie practically shoved two local politicians aside as she marched across the ballroom floor, her heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet. Jada trailed right behind her, her eyes darting nervously around the room to see who was watching this confrontation unfold. "What do you think you are doing here?" Valerie hissed, stopping 2 feet away from me. She kept her voice low, desperate to maintain her elegant facade in front of the wealthy guests mingling nearby. "Security was given explicit instructions to keep you off the guest list. This is a private event." I took a slow, elegant sip of my sparkling water. "I am attending my father's memorial, Valerie. Or at least that is what it says on the hotel marquee outside. Though judging by the tacky promotional banners you hung over the shrimp cocktail station, I assume Preston is planning to sell commercial timeshares during the eulogy." Jada stepped forward, crossing her arms to deliberately flash her heavy diamond bracelets in the ambient light. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here, Kendra. You look so desperate. Coming back to Atlanta to crash a party you could not afford to host in a million years. Did you spend your entire $5,000 inheritance on that dress? It is very plain." I let my gaze slowly travel from the top of Jada's heavily sprayed hair down to the flashy, gaudy diamonds choking her neck. I did not look angry. I looked mildly amused. It is vintage silk, Jada. It does not need to scream for attention. But those diamonds certainly do. They look incredibly heavy. I hope you kept the receipts. I hear the resale value on flashy stones drops significantly the second you walk out of the store. Valerie stepped closer, her jaw tight with suppressed rage. "You are just jealous. You thought you could come here and make us feel guilty. You thought you could ruin our night by standing in the corner looking pathetic. We hold the keys to the empire now. Look around you, Kendra. The most powerful investors in the state are in this room and they are all here for us." I glanced over Valerie's shoulder. I saw Preston standing near the main stage, sweating profusely through his tailored suit as he tried to corner a group of extremely wealthy private equity partners. He looked desperate, aggressively pushing his business cards into the hands of men who were actively trying to walk away from him. He was burning through his fake wealth, realizing in real time that the old money in this room did not respect him. He was a fraud, and the heavy hitters could smell it on him. "They are here for the free champagne, Valerie," I said softly, setting my glass down on the marble bar. "And they are watching you right now. I highly suggest you fix your face before your investors realize you are sweating." Valerie's eyes widened. She looked around and realized several high-profile guests were indeed watching our interaction with deep curiosity. Instead of backing down, the humiliation twisted her features into a dangerous, calculated smile. She wanted to prove she held the power. She turned on her heel and marched directly toward the main stage, signaling the audio technician to cut the jazz music. The entire room went silent as she grabbed the microphone. She was about to try and destroy me in front of everyone. The sharp, piercing screech of microphone feedback cut through the ballroom, instantly silencing the low hum of high society chatter. The jazz quartet stopped mid-note. Hundreds of heads turned toward the main stage. Valerie stood dead center under the blinding stage lights. She tapped the microphone twice with her manicured fingernail, ensuring she had the absolute undivided attention of every single investor, politician, and socialite in the room. She took a deep theatrical breath, allowing a perfectly calculated expression of sorrow to wash over her features. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Valerie began, her voice trembling with just the right amount of manufactured grief. "We gathered to honor the monumental legacy of my late husband, Jeremiah. He was a titan of Atlanta. But more importantly, he was a man who believed in building the future. And that is exactly why he would be so incredibly proud to see his son-in-law Preston and my beautiful daughter Jada launching their new luxury real estate firm tonight. They are taking the torch and carrying it forward." A smattering of polite applause rippled through the room. Preston puffed out his chest, adjusting his tie and nodding to a group of executives standing near the front. He looked desperate to belong in their world. "But family is not always perfect." Valerie continued, her tone suddenly shifting from triumphant to dripping with pity. The applause died down. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Valerie raised her hand to shield her eyes from the stage lights scanning the crowd until she pointed directly at me standing near the marble bar at the back of the ballroom. "Tonight we actually have an unexpected guest," Valerie announced, projecting her voice so it echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "My stepdaughter Kendra has decided to join us." The entire ballroom turned in unison. Hundreds of pairs of eyes locked onto me. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, the emerald silk of my gown draped flawlessly against my skin. I did not shrink back into the shadows. I simply held my glass of sparkling water and met their stares with absolute calm. Valerie gripped the microphone with both hands, laying her trap. "You see, Jeremiah carried a very heavy burden before he passed. He worried endlessly about Kendra. As many of you know, she walked away from her education. She rejected the safety of this family and ran off to Los Angeles to chase some very unrealistic dreams. It has been incredibly hard on us watching her struggle on the West Coast, bouncing from job to job, trying to scrape by in a world she simply was not prepared for." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. She was painting a masterpiece of delusion. She was trying to frame my multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire as a tragic cautionary tale of a lost, impoverished dropout. She wanted the Atlanta elite to look at me and see a failure so she could play the role of the benevolent, long-suffering matriarch. "That is why Preston and I have made a decision," Valerie declared, her voice swelling with fake heroism. "We are not going to let Jeremiah's daughter fall through the cracks. In honor of my late husband, we are establishing a special financial assistance fund specifically for Kendra. We want to bring her home. We want to pay for her rehabilitation, cover her living expenses, and help her get a fresh start. Because no matter how far she has fallen, we are a family that takes care of our own." The silence in the room was deafening. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air like thick smoke. I looked around the room. The true heavyweights, the old money billionaires and seasoned corporate sharks, were not looking at me with pity. They were looking at Valerie with visible discomfort. Wealth whispers, but desperation screams, and Valerie was screaming at the top of her lungs. Before the crowd could even process the sheer tackiness of her announcement, Preston bounded up the stairs and onto the stage. He grabbed the microphone from Valerie, his face flushed red from the champagne and the intoxicating thrill of having an audience. He thought this was his moment to prove he was an apex predator. "Let me tell you something about business," Preston bellowed into the microphone, flashing a slick, arrogant grin at the private equity partners he had been harassing all night. "You have to know when to cut your losses. But Valerie is right. We cannot have a member of our family sleeping on the streets of Los Angeles. It is just bad for the corporate brand." He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. He brandished it in the air like a weapon. "So let us get her started right now," Preston announced, his voice booming over the speakers. "I am writing a check tonight. 5 grand. 10 grand. Whatever it takes to get you a bus ticket and a decent meal. Kendra, I will personally sponsor your first month of rent in a nice, safe apartment complex somewhere out in the suburbs. Consider it a charitable donation from our new firm." Preston laughed loudly into the microphone. A few of his sycophantic frat bro friends near the front stage chuckled along with him, but the rest of the ballroom remained dead silent. I stood at the back of the room analyzing the scene with clinical precision. Preston was standing on a stage waving a checkbook tied to a logistics company that was currently $15 million in debt. He was publicly offering me $10,000 of fake money, completely unaware that I had $37 million of clean liquid capital sitting in a blind trust and a commercial skyscraper bearing my name. He was offering a bus ticket to a woman who owned the building he was desperately trying to lease. He was humiliating himself, and he lacked the basic intelligence to realize it. I watched the faces of the most powerful investors in the room. The men and women Preston needed to fund his fake real estate firm were physically recoiling. They exchanged sharp, judgmental glances. In the world of high finance, you do not air your family's dirty laundry at a corporate launch party. You do not mock a grieving daughter, and you certainly do not pull out a personal checkbook and scream about charitable donations like a drunken game show host. Preston was destroying his own pitch in real time. Kendra, Preston called out, pointing the checkbook directly at me from the stage. "Come on up here. Come take the check. Do not be proud. We all know you need it. Let us get you back on your feet." Every single camera phone in the room was suddenly raised lenses pointed in my direction. The guests held their breath, waiting for the stereotypical explosion. They waited for me to lose my temper, to scream, to throw my drink, and to validate the narrative Valerie had just spun. I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I stood tall in my emerald gown, radiating the kind of cold, untouchable power that you cannot buy on credit. I looked at Preston sweating and grinning on the stage. I looked at Valerie, her chest heaving with the thrill of her own cruelty. I looked at Jada, clutching her flashy diamonds in the front row. I slowly raised my glass of sparkling water, holding it up in a silent, perfectly composed toast to the three of them. I gave them a smile that did not reach my eyes, a smile that promised absolute ruin. Then I lowered my glass, turned my back to the stage, and let the silence stretch out, waiting for my trap to snap shut. The silence in the grand ballroom was so profound that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning units and the clinking of ice melting in a nearby champagne bucket. Over 300 of Atlanta's most powerful political figures, venture capitalists and real estate tycoons, stood perfectly still. They were all watching me. Up on the stage, Preston kept his leather checkbook extended in the air, a wide, unnatural grin plastered across his face. Valerie stood beside him, her chest heaving slightly, her eyes wide with the predatory thrill of what she believed was her ultimate victory. Jada was leaning forward in the front row, waiting for my spirit to break. They wanted a show. They wanted the loud, dramatic, broken stepdaughter to scream and cry, validating every single lie they had spun about my supposed failures. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute stillness of the room work in my favor. In the world of high finance and true wealth, the person who speaks first loses. The person who yells has already surrendered their power. I had $37 million of clean capital backing my posture. I did not need to shout. I raised my glass of sparkling water, holding it up toward the stage in a gesture of effortless grace. The light caught the vintage emerald ring on my finger, a subtle flash of genuine inherited legacy that no amount of Preston's borrowed money could ever replicate. "I appreciate the theatrical presentation, Preston," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was perfectly calibrated. It cut through the dead silence of the massive ballroom, crisp and chillingly polite. "And Valerie, your concern for my well-being is as touching tonight as it was on the afternoon of my father's funeral. But I must respectfully decline your charity." I took a measured step forward, ensuring my voice carried to the private equity partners standing near the front of the stage. "Please put your checkbook away, Preston," I continued, offering a warm, pitying smile. "You are launching a brand new real estate firm tonight. You have overhead costs, marketing fees, and a tremendous amount of operational debt to manage. I highly suggest you hold on to every single dollar in that account. You are going to need it much sooner than you think." The entire ballroom collectively inhaled. It was a surgical strike. I did not hurl insults. I did not curse. I simply treated them like struggling, inexperienced children who were foolishly waving their allowance money in public. The reaction from this crowd was immediate and devastating. The true heavyweights in the room, the multi-generational billionaires and the seasoned corporate sharks, physically recoiled from the stage. Wealth whispers, but desperation screams. Valerie and Preston had just screamed at the top of their lungs, and the old money of Atlanta found the entire display deeply repulsive. I watched a prominent banking executive, a man Preston had been aggressively shadowing all evening, lean over and whisper something to his wife. They both looked at Valerie with profound distaste, turned their backs to the stage, and began walking toward the exit. It was the ultimate social execution. In their desperation to humiliate me, my stepfamily had broken the cardinal rule of high society. You do not air your toxic family grievances to secure a business investment. It reeks of instability. And investors run from instability. Valerie saw the banking executive leaving. The triumphant glow completely vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden sharp panic. Her eyes darted around the ballroom, registering the shifting tide. The crowd was no longer looking at me with pity. They were looking at the stage with active disdain. Preston, entirely lacking the social awareness to realize he was bleeding credibility, doubled down. He gripped the microphone tighter, his knuckles turning white. "See everyone," Preston barked into the microphone, his voice echoing too loudly, sounding defensive and shrill. "This is exactly what we have to deal with. The absolute arrogance. She is too proud to accept a lifeline. We offer her a fresh start and she spits in our faces. We are trying to save her from herself." "You are embarrassing yourself, Preston." An older commanding voice cut through the crowd. "It was not me. It was Silas Washington, one of my late father's oldest friends and a founding board member of a massive commercial development group." Silas stood near the center of the room, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. He looked up at the stage with a mixture of pity and severe disappointment. "Jeremiah built his logistics empire on discretion and respect," Silas stated loudly, addressing Valerie directly. He would be absolutely horrified to see his memorial used as a stage for this tacky, classless spectacle. "Put the microphone down, Valerie. You have done enough damage to his memory for one night." A low murmur of agreement swept through the elite crowd. Valerie's mouth dropped open. She looked like she had just been slapped across the face. To be publicly reprimanded by Silas Washington was a social death sentence in Atlanta. Jada shrank back into her seat, suddenly trying to make herself look as small as possible, her hands dropping to cover her flashy diamond necklaces. I did not need to say another word. The room had done the work for me. I slowly lowered my glass. I gave Valerie one final unbothered look, letting her see the complete lack of fear in my eyes. I turned my back to the stage and began walking slowly toward the mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. The crowd did not block my path. As I walked, the throngs of wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites physically parted for me. They stepped aside, clearing a wide, unobstructed path to the exit. It was a visceral, undeniable display of respect. They were separating themselves from the sinking ship on the stage and aligning themselves with the quiet, composed power walking through their ranks. I heard Preston stammering into the microphone behind me, desperately trying to pivot the conversation back to his luxury real estate pitches. He was begging for their attention, his voice cracking with the realization that the room was actively turning against him. The jazz quartet hurriedly started playing again, a chaotic, off-tempo melody attempting to cover up the disastrous silence. I pushed through the heavy mahogany double doors and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted lobby of the hotel. The air out here was cool and refreshing, completely free of the toxic desperation suffocating the ballroom. I handed my ticket to the coat check attendant, retrieving my velvet wrap with a polite smile. I had not just survived their ambush. I had effortlessly redirected their own weapon and watched it explode right in their faces. My stepfamily was currently trapped in a room with hundreds of people who now viewed them as unstable, tasteless liabilities. Preston's firm was dead in the water before he even officially launched it. I slipped my arms into my coat, feeling a profound sense of clarity. The public theater was over. Now it was time for the final act. It was time for Preston to fly to California and step blindly into my boardroom. I walked out of the luxury hotel and into the warm Atlanta night, leaving the burning wreckage of their social standing far behind me. I slid my arms into the dark velvet wrap, letting the cool, quiet atmosphere of the hotel foyer wash over me. The coat check attendant handed me my clutch with a polite nod, completely unaware of the absolute devastation I had just unleashed in the ballroom behind me. I turned toward the grand glass exit doors, ready to step out into the warm Atlanta night and leave my stepfamily to drown in the wreckage of their own making. But the universe always has a way of delivering the perfect final blow. Before I could take another step, the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom burst open violently. A crowd of departing guests spilled out into the lobby, eager to escape the toxic, humiliating atmosphere Valerie and Preston had created. Right on their heels was Preston himself. He was practically sprinting across the polished marble floor, his expensive suit jacket flapping open, his face slick with a desperate, panicked sweat. He was chasing after one specific man in the crowd. That man was Harrison Caldwell. Harrison was a legendary African-American venture capitalist and one of the most ruthless commercial real estate moguls in the Southeast. He controlled billions of dollars in development funds. His presence at the gala was the only reason Preston had bothered to rent the ballroom. Securing an investment from Harrison Caldwell was the only way Preston could legitimize his fake luxury holding company and cover the massive, suffocating debts he had just inherited from my father's hollowed-out logistics firm. "Mr. Caldwell!" Preston gasped, nearly tripping over his own expensive leather loafers as he lunged forward to block the billionaire's path toward the valet stand. "Please, just give me 2 minutes of your time." Harrison Caldwell stopped. He was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a tailored charcoal suit that radiated quiet, undeniable authority. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly annoyed, the way one might look at a persistent mosquito. Preston thrust his trembling, sweaty right hand forward aggressively, invading Harrison's personal space. We did not get a chance to properly connect inside. Preston babbled, his voice pitched far too high. "The new firm Jada and I are launching is going to revolutionize luxury commercial spaces in Atlanta. We have the capital from Jeremiah's estate, we have the vision, and we would be honored to bring you in on the ground floor of our flagship development. It is a guaranteed return on investment." Valerie and Jada rushed through the mahogany doors just in time to witness this pathetic display. They hurried across the lobby, panting slightly, trying to arrange their features into masks of elegant sophistication. But they were too late. The desperation was already staining the air. Harrison Caldwell did not raise his hand to meet Preston's. He looked down at the outstretched, trembling palm with absolute freezing indifference. He let the silence stretch out, forcing Preston to stand there, with his hands suspended in midair, looking like an utter fool in front of the dozens of elite guests lingering in the grand foyer. "I do not do business with men who use memorial services to launch marketing campaigns," Harrison said, his deep voice echoing off the marble walls. "And I certainly do not invest capital with men who publicly humiliate their own family members to secure a cheap laugh. Your lack of discretion is a massive liability. Have a good evening." Harrison stepped neatly around Preston, leaving my brother-in-law completely paralyzed, his hands still frozen in the empty space between them. Valerie let out a sharp, horrified gasp. Jada covered her mouth, her eyes wide with the sudden, crushing realization that their grand social debut was officially dead on arrival. I stood near the exit, perfectly still, watching the execution. It was flawless. Harrison Caldwell adjusted his jacket cuffs and continued his stride toward the valet stand. But as he scanned the lobby, his sharp gaze locked onto me. He stopped walking. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his features, followed immediately by a look of profound, unwavering respect. The sea of departing socialites and wealthy investors instinctively parted again, clearing a direct path between the billionaire and myself. Preston, Valerie, and Jada watched in stunned silence as Harrison Caldwell, the man who had just treated Preston like a contagious disease, walked purposefully in my direction. Harrison stopped exactly 2 feet away from me. He did not extend his hand for a casual greeting. Instead, this legendary titan of industry slowly and deliberately bowed his head to me. "Ms. Kendra Harrison," said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby, "it is an absolute privilege to finally meet you in person." I offered him a warm, composed smile. "The privilege is mine, Mr. Caldwell. I have been following your acquisitions on the West Coast very closely," he continued, his tone filled with deep professional admiration. "The way you negotiated that multi-million-dollar commercial takeover last week was nothing short of brilliant. The Los Angeles skyline looks significantly better with your name on it. I expect we will be sitting across a boardroom table from each other very soon. My firm is highly interested in partnering with your holding company on your next expansion." The lobby was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Preston's jaw literally unhinged. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a manic, terrified confusion. His brain was violently short-circuiting as he tried to process the impossible reality unfolding in front of him. The struggling, pathetic dropout he had just offered a $10,000 charity check to was currently standing in a vintage emerald gown discussing multi-million-dollar coastal acquisitions with a billionaire who had just publicly crushed his entire future. Valerie looked like the floor had just opened up and swallowed her whole. She clutched her chest, her breathing shallow and erratic. The illusion she had spent decades building was shattering into a million sharp, jagged pieces. She realized in that exact moment that she had not defeated me on the day of my father's funeral. She had simply unleashed me. Jada was staring at the vintage emerald ring on my finger. Her eyes darted from the ring to Harrison Caldwell and then to my face. The sheer weight of my actual undeniable power crushed the breath right out of her lungs. "I look forward to that meeting, Mr. Caldwell," I replied smoothly, giving him a gracious nod. "Have a safe drive home." Harrison offered one last respectful bow and walked out through the glass doors, the valet immediately rushing forward to open the door of his waiting car. I turned my attention back to the three statues standing frozen in the middle of the hotel lobby. I did not gloat. I did not laugh. I simply looked at them with the cold, detached pity one reserves for a dying insect. They had built a spectacular gallows, and they had eagerly placed their own necks inside the noose. I pulled my velvet wrap a little tighter around my shoulders, my posture impeccable. "Like I said, Preston," I murmured, my voice slicing through the heavy silence one final time. "Hold on to your checkbook. You are going to need every single penny." I turned my back on my step. Family stepped through the heavy glass doors and walked out into the warm, humid Atlanta night. My black car was already idling at the curb, the driver holding the rear door open for me. I slid into the plush leather seat and watched through the tinted window as Preston, Jada, and Valerie remained frozen in the lobby, completely trapped in the ashes of their own arrogance. The public reckoning was over. Now all I had to do was fly back to California and wait for them to walk blindly into my boardroom. Exactly 30 days passed since I walked out of that suffocating Atlanta ballroom and left my stepfamily choking on the ashes of their ruined social standing. 30 days is a very brief window of time for most people, but in the world of high finance and toxic leverage, it is more than enough time for a desperate man to hang himself. The financial grace period I had orchestrated with Donovan was rapidly evaporating. The massive shadow loans Valerie had taken out against my father's logistics company were days away from triggering automatic default clauses. The banks were quietly sharpening their knives. Elias called me on a bright Tuesday morning while I was reviewing architectural blueprints in my Los Angeles penthouse office. His voice carried a mixture of deep satisfaction and utter disbelief. "They are boarding a first-class flight to Los Angeles International Airport right now," Elias told me. "Preston is absolutely panicking, Kendra. Harrison Caldwell's public rejection at the gala was the kiss of death for his new luxury real estate firm. Every single old money investor in Georgia pulled their funding. Nobody in the South will touch him. So he is pivoting west. He thinks he can secure overseas venture capital from Asian markets if he has a prestigious flagship address in California." I set my coffee cup down on the glass desk, a cold smile spreading across my face. "What is his target, Elias?" "He wants to lease the penthouse executive floors of the newest commercial skyscraper in downtown Los Angeles," Elias said, reading from a leaked corporate itinerary. "He is attempting to sign a $10 million 10-year commercial lease. He thinks establishing a massive corporate footprint on the West Coast will trick international investors into giving him the capital he needs to save the logistics company back home. He is bringing the final drops of equity from your father's shell company to use as the primary guarantor for the lease." My smile widened into a silent, triumphant laugh. He was walking directly into the trap. The skyscraper he was targeting, the towering monument of glass and black marble he desperately wanted to slap his fake corporate logo on, belonged entirely to me. Preston had absolutely no idea. My ownership was legally buried behind 3 impenetrable layers of corporate holding companies. To him, he was just flying across the country to negotiate with a faceless California real estate conglomerate. He thought he was making the ultimate boss move to save his dying empire. He did not realize he was personally delivering his financial execution papers straight to my desk. Who is traveling with him? I asked, leaning back in my leather executive chair. Valerie and Jada. Elias scoffed. They are treating this like a royal vacation. They booked 3 adjoining luxury suites at the Beverly Hills Hotel. They brought empty designer luggage just to fill it up on Rodeo Drive. They are completely oblivious to the fact that the credit cards they are swiping are tied to a company that is essentially insolvent. Preston is too cowardly to tell them the truth about the debt, so he is just letting them spend whatever phantom money they have left while he tries to pull off this miracle lease. Let them shop, I said softly. Let them buy every overpriced handbag and diamond watch they can carry. When I ended the call, I immediately contacted the head of my commercial leasing department. I instructed him to roll out the red carpet for Preston. I wanted my staff to send him glossy brochures, offer him premium espresso, and validate every single one of his delusions of grandeur. I wanted Preston to feel like the most important man in Los Angeles, right up until the exact moment I cut the floor out from under him. For the next 48 hours, I monitored their movements through the careful surveillance of my private security team. The contrast between Preston's frantic desperation and the blissful, greedy ignorance of Valerie and Jada was a masterpiece of tragic comedy. While Preston was locked in his hotel suite, sweating through his tailored shirts and desperately reviewing his fraudulent financial projections, Valerie and Jada were parading down Rodeo Drive. My security detail sent me updates of their shopping spree. They were strutting through high-end boutiques demanding VIP champagne service and treating the retail workers like absolute peasants. Jada purchased 2 vintage Hermes bags on a corporate credit line that was 60 days past due. Valerie bought a custom designer wardrobe for the upcoming corporate ribbon cutting she firmly believed they were going to host. They were spending my father's hard-earned legacy on frivolous, flashy garbage, completely unaware that the financial guillotine was already dropping. On Thursday morning, the trap was finally set. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, looking down at the bustling streets of downtown Los Angeles. My office was located at the very top of the skyscraper Preston was coming to lease. My desk phone buzzed. It was the head of building security. Miss Kendra, the security chief, reported. A rented luxury SUV just pulled up to the front valet. The party from Atlanta has arrived. I turned away from the window and walked over to the bank of security monitors mounted on my office wall. The high-definition cameras captured every angle of the grand lobby below. I watched the glass revolving doors spin. Preston walked in first, clutching an expensive leather briefcase against his chest like a life preserver. Even through the security feed, I could see the visible tension radiating from his shoulders. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn, carrying the crushing weight of $15 million in hidden debt. He was a man walking to the gallows, hoping to find a bag of gold at the top of the stairs. Right behind him marched Valerie and Jada. They were a stark, ridiculous contrast to Preston's panic. They walked into my building wearing their brand-new Rodeo Drive purchases, their arms dripping with shopping bags, and their faces set in expressions of supreme, unearned arrogance. Valerie paused in the center of the sprawling marble lobby, looking up at the towering glass atrium with a smug, possessive gleam in her eyes. She leaned over and whispered something to Jada, likely bragging about how this massive skyscraper was going to be their new West Coast playground. Jada pulled out her phone and immediately started taking selfies in the center of the lobby, posing with her designer shopping bags, making sure to capture the expensive modern art installations behind her. She was already drafting the social media posts to show the Atlanta elites that they had conquered California. I stood in my quiet, climate-controlled office watching the 3 of them on the monitors. They had no idea they were standing in my house. They had no idea the marble floors they were walking on, the glass elevators they were about to enter, and the very air they were breathing inside this building belonged to the woman they had thrown out like garbage. Send them up to the executive leasing office on the 49th floor. I instructed my security chief, my voice cold and steady. Let them get comfortable. Give them the premium water. Agree to whatever outrageous demands they make. I watched on the screen as my professional lobby staff approached them with warm, accommodating smiles, guiding the oblivious trio toward the private VIP elevators. Preston wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, adjusting his tie as the polished metal doors slid shut, carrying him upward toward his ultimate destruction. The pieces were perfectly aligned. The debt was locked. The pride was inflated to its absolute breaking point. I turned off the security monitors and walked slowly toward the private boardroom door connected to my office. It was time to introduce my stepfamily to the real owner of the Los Angeles skyline. The polished chrome doors of the private VIP elevator slid open on the 49th floor with a soft melodic chime. I was sitting at my desk in the adjacent master executive suite, watching the high-definition security feed with the volume turned all the way up. The camera angles gave me a perfect, unobstructed view of the executive leasing reception area. I leaned back in my chair, laced my fingers together, and watched the prey walk blindly into the cage. The reception space was deliberately designed to intimidate. It featured stark white marble floors, a massive living green wall, and a custom-built black quartz reception desk that stretched across the center of the room. The entire floor whispered of billions, not millions. It was a space built to make even the wealthiest executives feel small. Preston stepped off the elevator first. He immediately puffed out his chest, aggressively adjusting his tie and shooting a smug look over his shoulder at Jada and Valerie. He walked toward the reception desk with the exaggerated swagger of a man who had watched entirely too many Wall Street movies, but fundamentally misunderstood how actual power operated. Right behind him, Jada and Valerie dragged their fresh Rodeo Drive shopping bags across the pristine marble. They were loudly complaining about the dry California heat, their voices echoing shrilly through the quiet, sophisticated space. Jada dropped her heavy designer bags directly onto a custom Italian leather sofa, completely disregarding the delicate material. Valerie huffed, fanning herself with a manicured hand while casting a highly critical, condescending glare at the minimalist modern art hanging on the walls. My lead leasing coordinator, a sharp, incredibly poised young African-American man named Carter, stood behind the quartz desk. I had personally briefed him that morning. I told Carter to treat them like absolute royalty, to feed their delusions, and to validate every single drop of their unearned entitlement until they were completely intoxicated by their own fake importance. Preston did not even bother to offer a basic greeting. He marched straight up to the desk, leaned his weight heavily onto the black quartz, and snapped his fingers directly in Carter's face. "Listen to me very closely," Preston commanded, his voice dripping with the kind of racial and classist arrogance that made my blood boil. "I have a $10 million commercial lease to sign, and I am on a very tight schedule. Go fetch the head of commercial leasing right now. I do not deal with secretaries or middle management." Carter did not flinch. He offered a flawless professional smile, playing his role to absolute perfection. "Welcome to the executive suite, sir. We have been expecting your arrival. Please allow me to make your party comfortable while I arrange the final details." Preston scoffed, looking back at Jada with a self-satisfied smirk, clearly proud of how he had just spoken to my employee. Jada kicked her expensive heels off and carelessly hoisted her bare feet onto a $20,000 coffee table. "You there?" Jada called out, pointing a long acrylic fingernail at a passing hospitality assistant. "Bring us some sparkling water, and make sure it is imported. I absolutely refuse to drink whatever local tap water you people serve on this side of the country." The assistant, trained to handle high-profile tantrums, nodded politely and hurried away to fulfill her ridiculous demand. Valerie chimed in, wrinkling her nose as she looked around the sleek, modern lobby. "The air conditioning in this building is entirely too aggressive," Valerie complained loudly, directing her ire at Carter. "You need to adjust the temperature immediately. This ultra-modern new money aesthetic is so incredibly cold. It severely lacks the warmth and sophisticated grace we are accustomed to back in Atlanta. But I suppose we can bring our own decorators to fix this sterile environment once we take over the penthouse." Carter smiled graciously. "I will have the climate control adjusted right away, ma'am. We want to ensure your absolute comfort." I watched the audio meters spike on my security monitor, taking a slow sip of my black coffee. The sheer blinding audacity radiating from the three of them was staggering. They were sitting in my building, snapping their fingers at my staff and loudly insulting my interior design choices, all while completely broke. Preston turned his attention back to Carter, loudly tapping his knuckles against the desk. "Let me make something crystal clear. he boasted, his voice booming through the lobby. "We are launching the premier luxury real estate firm in the Southeast. We are backed by one of the largest logistics empires in the state of Georgia. I need to make sure this building's corporate pedigree actually matches our massive brand. I am looking for exclusivity. I am looking for prestige." I watched Preston casually drop my late father's business metrics to impress a receptionist. He threw around revenue numbers that were currently $15 million in the red. He bragged about cash reserves that Valerie had already drained. He was using a dying, debt-ridden company as proof of his superiority, entirely unaware that the woman he had kicked out of his house held the actual financial ledgers in the very next room. "I need a private tour of the penthouse floors before I sign a single document." Preston continued, his demands escalating as his ego inflated. "And I am going to need structural changes. That eastern-facing wall in the corner office needs to be knocked down to create an open-concept executive suite for me. I assume your construction team can handle a rapid build-out." The absolute height of his delusion was breathtaking. Preston did not even have the credit score to finance a used sedan without my father's forged signature, but he was standing in my lobby demanding structural demolition on a billion-dollar skyscraper. Carter nodded with practiced reverence, setting the final hook exactly as I had instructed. "Of course," Sir Carter said smoothly, his tone laced with deep respect. "However, our building owner is highly particular about our flagship tenants. Given the sheer magnitude of your proposed lease and the prestige of your company, the owner requested to bypass the standard leasing agents and handle your final approval personally." Preston ate it up instantly. His chest puffed out even further. The idea that the owner of a Los Angeles skyscraper wanted a private audience with him stroked his fragile ego perfectly. He loved the idea of bypassing the normal procedures to deal with the top decision-maker. "Excellent," Preston declared, shooting a triumphant look at Valerie and Jada. "That is exactly how real business is done. Take me to him. I love dealing directly with the top dog. Let us get this contract signed so we can go celebrate on Rodeo Drive." Carter stepped out from behind the quartz desk and gestured toward the heavy frosted glass doors of the grand boardroom at the far end of the reception area. "Right this way," Sir Carter said, his voice lowering with dramatic effect. "The owner is waiting for you inside." I set my coffee mug down on my desk. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer and took a slow, centering breath. The wait was over. They had walked blindly into the slaughterhouse complaining about the temperature, while the butcher sharpened the knives. I stood up, walked over to the private connecting door, and stepped into the grand boardroom to take my seat at the head of the table. The frosted glass doors of the grand boardroom swung open with a smooth, solid glide. I was already seated at the head of the 30-foot solid mahogany conference table. Seconds before they walked in, I had deliberately swiveled my high-backed black leather executive chair around, so I was completely facing the floor-to-ceiling windows. From their vantage point at the entrance, they could only see the towering back of my chair and the breathtaking panoramic view of the Los Angeles skyline stretching out toward the Pacific Ocean. Carter led them into the massive room. His footsteps were silent on the plush custom carpet, while the sharp clicks of Jada and Valerie's designer heels echoed loudly against the acoustic wood-paneled walls. The boardroom was designed specifically to intimidate. It was a cavernous space of dark wood, brushed steel, and absolute quiet. It was an environment that demanded respect. "Please make yourselves comfortable," Carter said, his voice a flawless blend of courtesy and professional distance. "The building owner is currently finishing a brief call and reviewing the final stipulations of your proposed commercial lease. The owner will be with you momentarily." Preston immediately puffed up entirely, missing the subtle warning in Carter's words. "Take your time," Preston replied loudly, projecting his voice across the long table to ensure the person sitting in the chair could hear his supposed confidence. "We appreciate a thorough review process. My firm values precision." "I will leave you to it," Carter said politely. He stepped backward, slipped through the frosted glass doors, and let them click firmly shut. The trap was sealed. I sat perfectly still in my chair, staring out at the sun reflecting off the glass towers of downtown. I controlled my breathing, making absolutely no sound. For a few seconds, the room was quiet. Then the sheer, intoxicating scale of the boardroom hit them, and their complete lack of class took over. "Look at this view, ladies," Preston whispered loudly, his voice vibrating with frantic, greedy energy. I heard the rustle of fabric as he paced near the far end of the mahogany table. "This is it. This is the apex. Once we secure this penthouse lease, our firm is going to be untouchable. The international investors will literally throw venture capital at us the second they see this address on our corporate letterhead." I heard a heavy thud as Jada callously dropped her new designer shopping bags directly onto the polished mahogany surface. "Oh my gosh, Preston!" She squealed, her heels clicking rapidly as she rushed toward the side windows. "I have to take a picture with the Hollywood sign in the background. The lighting in here is absolutely flawless. Let me fix my necklace." Valerie let out a long, dramatic sigh of approval. "I must admit the minimalist aesthetic is a bit cold for my personal taste, but you cannot deny the raw power in this room." She paced slowly, her voice echoing as she admired the space. "This is exactly the kind of prestige our family brand deserves." Jeremiah built a solid little local business, but he always played it far too safe. He lacked the global vision we possess. It takes a bold mindset to step onto the national stage like this. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon. The absolute audacity of Valerie calling my father's massive self-made empire a solid little local business, while she was actively drowning in $15 million of debt, made my blood run freezing cold. She was standing in a billion-dollar skyscraper, built on the foundation of my father's true legacy, completely oblivious to her own impending ruin. Preston began pacing back and forth across the carpet, clearly trying to burn off his nervous adrenaline. "Listen to me closely," Preston instructed them, his tone shifting into aggressive management mode. "When the owner turns around, I am going to do all the talking. Do not interrupt me. Do not talk about the shopping trip. We need to project absolute corporate dominance. We are requesting a $10 million lease. I am going to offer them a significant upfront deposit using the final liquid credit lines from the logistics company." Jada paused her impromptu photo shoot. "Are you sure we have enough cash left in those accounts, Preston? We just spent a fortune at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and my new car lease was huge." Preston scoffed dismissively. "Do not worry about the logistics accounts, Jada. I signed the personal guarantees yesterday to extend the corporate margins. We have exactly enough leverage left to secure this lease and pay the initial retainer. Once we sign this contract today, we use the building prestige to lock down the Asian equity partners next week. We take their investment capital, backfill the debt in Atlanta, and we are completely in the clear. It is a flawless corporate strategy." I sat motionless in my leather chair, absorbing every single word. It was a literal, verbal confession of federal corporate fraud. He was openly admitting to using toxic debt and forged margins to secure a fraudulent commercial lease, all while standing in a room wired with top-tier corporate security microphones. He was handing me his financial head on a silver platter. Valerie chuckled softly, the sound dripping with toxic superiority. "It really is a brilliant plan, Preston. I am so proud of how you stepped up to lead the family. You are a true visionary. I just wish a certain someone could see us right now." Jada chimed in, her voice laced with vicious high school cruelty. "Can you imagine the look on Kendra's face if she could see us standing in the most expensive boardroom in California?" Preston let out a loud, barking laugh. "Kendra is probably sitting in gridlock traffic on the 405 freeway right now, driving a beat-up sedan and stressing about how she is going to pay her electric bill. She thought she was so smart walking out of that will reading. She thought she was proving a point. Instead, she gave up her only chance at a stable paycheck. Let her rot in her little two-bedroom apartment. We are playing in the major leagues now." They all laughed together, a chorus of greedy, arrogant sounds echoing through my boardroom. They were celebrating their magnificent triumph, completely blinded by their own towering narcissism. They felt invincible. They believed they had successfully stolen my father's legacy, humiliated me in front of Atlanta high society, and secured their place among the global elite. Preston cleared his throat loudly, clapping his hands together to bring their focus back. "All right, ladies, settle down. Get your game faces on. The owner should be turning around any second now. Remember, we are the new titans of Southern real estate. We own the room. I heard Preston walk to the end of the mahogany table. He planted his feet firmly on the carpet, adjusted the collar of his suit jacket, and shot his cuffs to make sure my father's stolen platinum watch was perfectly visible on his wrist. He was ready to deliver the pitch of his life. I sat in my high-backed chair for 3 more seconds, letting the absolute silence of the room settle over them like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I savored the final moments of their delusion. I let them stand at the very peak of their imaginary mountain. Then I placed my hands firmly on the armrests of my leather chair. I pressed my foot against the floor and slowly began to swivel around to face them. Can you describe how you want Preston's initial reaction to look when he realizes it is you? The heavy leather chair glided silently on its axis as I turned to face the room. The late afternoon Los Angeles sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, casting me in a stark silhouette. I did not smile. I did not offer a greeting. I simply let my hands rest flat against the polished mahogany desk and watched the absolute destruction of their reality unfold in real time. Preston was the first to comprehend what he was looking at. The arrogant swagger he had carried into the room evaporated instantly. The practiced corporate grin slid off his face, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his cheeks so rapidly that his skin took on a sickly grayish hue. He took a stumbling half-step backward, his expensive leather loafers scraping awkwardly against the custom carpet. Jada dropped her phone. The device hit the massive conference table with a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. She stared at me, her eyes wide and unblinking, her brain violently rejecting the image in front of her. Valerie let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She clutched her diamond necklace, her hand trembling so fiercely the stones rattled against her collarbone. She looked like she had just seen a ghost step out of a grave. "Welcome to Los Angeles," I said. My voice was calm, surgical, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I hope the climate control in my lobby is finally to your liking, Valerie." Preston opened his mouth, but only a dry, wheezing sound came out. He looked wildly around the cavernous boardroom, his panicked eyes darting to the frosted glass doors, the security cameras in the corners, and finally back to me. He was desperately searching for a punchline, a hidden camera, a mistake. Kendra Valerie breathed out the word, scraping painfully against her throat. "What are you doing sitting in that chair? Where is the owner of the building?" I stood up slowly, smoothing the lines of my tailored blazer. "You are looking at her." Jada let out a shrill, hysterical laugh, shaking her head in frantic denial. "No, that is impossible. You are a dropout. You live in a cheap apartment. You took a $5,000 check and ran. You do not own a skyscraper." I reached into the sleek leather portfolio resting on my desk. I pulled out a thick stack of certified legal documents bound by heavy brass clips. I tossed them onto the center of the mahogany table. They landed with a heavy, satisfying thud right next to Jada's discarded designer shopping bags. "Those are the ownership deeds and the municipal commercial zoning permits," I explained, projecting my voice clearly across the room. "Purchased outright by my holding company. I own the marble lobby you just insulted. I own the private elevator you rode up in. And I own every single inch of the floor you are currently standing on." Preston stumbled forward. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the edges of the heavy parchment. He flipped open the top folder, his pale eyes darting back and forth across the federal seals and the irrefutable legal signatures. He read my name, printed in bold black ink, as the sole proprietor of the billion-dollar property. A profound, sickening panic washed over his features. He dropped the documents as if they had physically burned his hands. But how Valerie stammered, her voice cracking as she grabbed the back of a leather chair to keep her knees from buckling. "The estate, the will. We saw the will. You got nothing." "You saw a decoy, Valerie," I said, stepping around the desk and walking slowly toward them. "You saw a piece of paper designed to keep you distracted. My father knew exactly what kind of parasites you and your daughter were. He knew you viewed him as nothing more than a bank account. He knew that the very second he took his last breath, you would try to strip me of my legacy and bleed his empire dry." Valerie shook her head, tears of panic finally welling in her eyes. "No, Jeremiah loved me. He left me the company. He left you a distraction, I corrected her sharply. Over the last 5 years, my father quietly liquidated every single clean, high-performing asset he possessed. He extracted the real wealth right under your nose. He moved $37 million into an offshore blind trust, and he put my name on it. 37 million, Jada repeated, her voice reduced to a pathetic hollow squeak. It activated the moment his heart stopped, I confirmed. Completely untouchable. Entirely in my name. The money you have been throwing away on Rodeo Drive today, the money you used to buy those ridiculous diamonds choking your neck, is phantom cash. You are entirely broke. Preston clutched his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. He looked down at the vintage platinum watch on his wrist, the watch he had stolen from my father's personal collection. The gravity of his situation was finally crushing his chest. The logistics company. Preston stammered, sweat pouring down his temples and staining the collar of his expensive dress shirt. We inherited the operations. We have the corporate credit lines. We have the assets. I reached into my portfolio one last time. I pulled out a slim, bright red folder. I slid it across the polished mahogany table directly into Preston's trembling hands. Open it, I commanded. He fumbled with the cover, flipping it open to reveal a highly detailed federal financial audit. His eyes scanned the red numbers, the negative balances, and the catastrophic default projections. That is the true financial analysis of the company you fought so desperately to steal from me, I stated, my voice dropping into a lethal quiet register. Valerie spent the last 5 years secretly mortgaging the corporate assets to fund her country club lifestyle. The logistics company is a hollow shell. It is $15 million in the red. Preston staggered backward, hitting the edge of the conference table. No. No, that cannot be right. The bank accounts showed available margins. Because I instructed my legal team to block the default notices, I revealed, watching the absolute horror dawn on his face. I let you believe the credit lines were open. I let you swagger into luxury dealerships and sign commercial leases. I let you act like a titan of industry. And yesterday, to fund this little trip to Los Angeles, you did exactly what I needed you to do. You signed the personal executive guarantees to extend the corporate margins. Preston dropped the red folder. It hit the floor, spilling the disastrous financial records across my custom carpet. He looked at me with hollow, dead eyes. He knew exactly what he had done. He had legally bound his own name to a sinking ship. The bank is calling in the debt tomorrow morning, I said, stepping right up to the edge of the table, locking eyes with the man who had thrown a crumpled $20 bill at my feet. The creditors are going to seize your cars, your homes, and everything you purchased with those fraudulent margins. Preston let out a breathless, desperate sound, realizing he was facing absolute financial ruin and potential federal fraud charges. You didn't inherit an empire, Preston, I said, my voice ringing with total undeniable finality. You inherited a ticking time bomb, and I just cut the wire. The absolute silence that followed my words was heavy enough to crush bone. Preston stared at the red financial folder on the mahogany table as if it were a live grenade. His chest heaved. He reached up and loosened his expensive silk tie, his fingers completely devoid of their former arrogant dexterity. The reality of the personal guarantees he had signed was finally paralyzing his brain. He had legally tethered his own name, his own social security number, and his entire future to $15 million of toxic, unrecoverable corporate debt. Jada broke the silence with a shrill, hysterical shriek. She lunged forward and grabbed Preston by the lapels of his tailored suit jacket, her heavy diamond bracelets clanking violently against his chest. She shook him, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive fabric. "Tell me, she is lying. Preston?" She screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. "Tell me you did not sign our names to a bankrupt company. Tell me you did not guarantee those loans." Preston could not even look at his wife. He kept his eyes locked on the red folder. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Valerie stepped back, pressing her hands against her cheeks. Her silver sequined dress suddenly looked cheap and ridiculous in the cold light of my boardroom. She looked from me to Preston, her mind frantically trying to calculate a way out of the slaughterhouse, but there was no exit. Before Valerie could launch into another desperate manipulation tactic, the heavy frosted glass doors of my boardroom swung open. Elias walked in. He wore a pristine navy blue suit, holding a sleek leather briefcase. He did not look like the defeated, reluctant estate attorney they had met in Atlanta. He looked like an apex predator who had just cornered his dinner. Right behind Elias walked two men in nondescript dark suits. They wore federal badges clipped to their belts. "Hello again, Valerie," Elias said, his deep voice carrying a note of absolute, undeniable authority. "Preston. Jada. I hope the flight to Los Angeles was comfortable." Preston stumbled backward, putting the heavy mahogany conference table between himself and the federal agents. "What is this?" Preston stammered, his eyes darting wildly toward the door. "What are they doing here?" Elias set his briefcase down on my glass desk and snapped the brass locks open. He pulled out a stack of banking documents heavily highlighted in yellow ink. "These gentlemen are investigators with the Federal Fraud Division." Elias explained, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. "When the logistics company accounts hit zero yesterday afternoon, the banks automatically initiated a hard audit. They found a very interesting paper trail, Preston. It seems that in order to secure the cash for your flights, your luxury hotel suites, and the massive deposit you intended to drop on this commercial lease, you attempted to access an escrow account that did not exist." Preston turned the color of ash. He backed up until his spine hit the floor-to-ceiling window. "You forged Jeremiah's signature on a series of retroactive corporate authorizations." Elias continued, stepping closer to the table. "You tried to backdate financial margins to trick the creditors into releasing their hold on the remaining corporate assets. That is not just bad business, Preston. That is federal wire fraud." The two investigators stepped forward into the room. "Mr. Preston," they said in unison, "we need you to come with us immediately." The second the federal agents moved toward him, the arrogant, aggressive finance bro completely evaporated. Preston did not stand his ground. He did not try to protect his wife or his mother-in-law. The absolute cowardice in his soul exploded to the surface. "It was not my idea," Preston screamed, his voice cracking like a terrified child. He pointed a trembling, sweaty finger directly at Valerie. "She made me do it. She told me the accounts were secure. She told me Jeremiah had hidden cash reserves. She forced me to sign the guarantees so she could keep her country club membership. She is the one who bled the company dry. I was just following her instructions." Valerie let out a horrified, blood-curdling gasp. "You pathetic, lying coward!" she shrieked, lunging across the table and trying to claw at Preston's face. "You are the one who wanted the CEO title. You are the one who wanted to play real estate tycoon. Do not, you dare try to put this on me." Jada burst into hysterical tears, backing away from both her husband and her mother. She clutched her head, her fake diamond tiara slipping sideways and falling onto the carpet. The federal agents moved swiftly. They grabbed Preston by his arms, spinning him around and slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The metallic click echoed sharply in the quiet boardroom. Preston was hyperventilating, crying openly as they marched him toward the frosted glass doors. He begged Elias to help him. He begged Jada to call a lawyer, but nobody moved a single muscle. I stood perfectly still behind my desk, watching the man who had thrown a crumpled $20 bill at my feet get dragged out of my building in handcuffs. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the cold, satisfying weight of absolute justice. Elias turned his attention back to Valerie and Jada. The women were huddled together near the window, shaking and crying, completely stripped of their arrogance. "The federal authorities have frozen all corporate and personal assets tied to the logistics company," Elias informed them coldly. "The vehicles you leased last week are currently being repossessed in Atlanta. Your corporate credit cards are void. I highly suggest you find a way to pay for your hotel bill because the estate is officially locked down." Elias offered me a respectful nod, closed his briefcase, and walked out of the boardroom. I looked at my stepmother and my stepsister. They were standing in the wreckage of their own greed. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. "Carter," I said, keeping my voice smooth and professional, "please escort these two women out of my building. They will not be signing a lease today." 2 weeks later, the reality of their destruction was absolute and undeniable. The illusion of their high society life in Atlanta had shattered into a million jagged pieces. The banks had descended on my father's Buckhead estate like vultures. Valerie's custom Mercedes and Jada's Range Rover were towed straight out of the country club parking lot, in broad daylight in front of the exact same elite socialites Valerie had spent decades trying to impress. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their credit lines were terminated. Preston was sitting in a federal holding cell, completely unable to post his massive bail. They had absolutely nowhere left to hide. They had no friends left to manipulate. I was reviewing a new commercial zoning permit in my Los Angeles office when my desk phone buzzed. It was the head of my ground floor security team. Ms. Kendra, the security chief, said, his voice laced with deep skepticism. "I have two women down here in the main lobby. They are causing quite a scene. They are demanding to be led up to your executive suite. They are claiming to be your immediate family." I set my pen down on the glass desk. The sweet, inevitable crawl had finally arrived. "I will come down," I instructed. "Keep them at the security desk." I took the private executive elevator down to the grand lobby. When the polished metal doors slid open, I stepped out into the expansive marble atrium. The scene unfolding near the front desk was pathetic. Valerie and Jada were standing in the center of the lobby, surrounded by three of my heavily armed security guards. The contrast between their previous visit and today was staggering. They were not wearing fresh designer clothes from Rodeo Drive. They looked completely disheveled. Jada was wearing a pair of faded sweatpants and an oversized hoodie. Her hair was messy and unstyled. She clutched a single scuffed handbag against her chest. Valerie looked like she had aged 20 years in 14 days. Her posture was stooped, her makeup was entirely absent, and she looked utterly exhausted. I later found out they had scrounged together their last few dollars just to buy budget airline tickets. They had flown economy on a discount carrier, dragging themselves across the country because they had absolutely zero options left. When Valerie saw me walking across the marble floor, she completely abandoned whatever remaining shreds of pride she held. She literally broke through the security perimeter and rushed toward me, her hands clasped together in front of her chest. "Kendra!" Valerie cried out, her voice cracking with raw desperation. "Thank God! Please, you have to talk to us. You have to listen to me." I stopped 10 feet away from her, keeping my hands resting casually in the pockets of my tailored trousers. My security guards instantly stepped up to flank me, ready to physically remove her at my command. I held up a single hand, instructing them to wait. "You are trespassing in my building, Valerie," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the massive lobby. "I suggest you speak quickly." Jada stumbled forward, tears streaming down her face. She looked nothing like the smug, entitled golden child who had mocked me at my father's funeral. She looked broken. "Kendra, please." Jada begged, her voice trembling. "We lost everything. The banks took the house. They took the cars. Preston's lawyers are demanding a retainer we cannot afford. We are staying in a cheap motel, and our cards are getting declined. We have absolutely nothing left." Valerie fell to her knees right there on the pristine white marble. The woman who had obsessed over status and keeping up appearances for her entire life was now openly groveling on the floor of my commercial lobby. "We are family." Kendra Valerie wept, her tears splashing onto the polished stone. "Please do not do this to us. Your father would never want to see us on the street. He loved us. You have $37 million. You own this entire skyscraper. Just give us enough to save the house in Atlanta. Just give us a loan. We will do anything you want. I will apologize for everything. Please, you cannot just leave us with nothing." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had made my teenage years a living nightmare. I looked at the woman who had thrown 2 trash bags at my feet on the most devastating day of my life. She wanted me to save her from the exact trap she had eagerly built with her own 2 hands. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy. I felt only the supreme quiet power of total victory. I looked down at Valerie. The woman who had terrorized my youth, who had paraded around Atlanta like a queen, was now a pathetic and sniveling mess on my polished floor. She reached out with trembling fingers, desperately trying to grasp the hem of my tailored trousers. I took a deliberate step back, ensuring she could not touch me. "We are family, Kendra." Valerie sobbed, the tears ruining her unkempt face and staining the collar of her oversized sweatshirt. "You cannot just turn your back on us. Your father would be absolutely heartbroken to see us living in a cheap motel. Jeremiah loved us. He would want you to help us. He would want you to share the wealth and protect his name." The sheer audacity of her invoking my father's name extinguished any lingering drop of humanity I might have felt. She was using a dead man's memory as a bargaining chip to save her own skin after she had spent years treating me like absolute garbage. "Do not ever speak his name to me again," I said, my voice dropping to a low and lethal register that echoed sharply through the cavernous lobby. "You did not love my father. You loved his bank accounts. You loved the country club memberships and the luxury cars his hard work afforded you. The second he died, you threw his only biological child out of her own home with 2 plastic trash bags. You did not even wait for his grave to settle before you started plotting to steal whatever scraps you thought I had left." Jada wept louder, burying her face in her hands and sinking to the floor next to her mother. "We were just scared, Kendra. We did not know what to do when the banks called." "You were greedy, Jada," I corrected her coldly. "You were arrogant. You and Preston thought you were untouchable. You thought you could mock me, steal my inheritance, and parade around high society on borrowed money. You made your choices and you celebrated them." Valerie shook her head frantically, her palms flat against the cold marble. "Please, Kendra, I am begging you. Just a loan. Just enough to get the Buckhead house back from the bank before it goes to auction. We will pay you back. I will sign whatever you want. I will work for you. Please, you have $37 million. You own this entire building. You will not even notice the money is gone." I looked at the woman who had made my teenage years a living nightmare. I looked at the stepsister, who had gleefully participated in every single act of cruelty. They wanted a bailout. They expected the black woman they had mocked and discarded to swoop in and play the ultimate savior. "You are right about one thing, Valerie," I said smoothly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "I do have $37 million, and I own this entire skyscraper. But I am not going to give you a single dime." Valerie's breath hitched. She stared up at me, her eyes wide with total devastation, as the finality of my words crushed the last ounce of hope from her chest. "My father was a brilliant man." I continued, making sure every word carved deep into her soul. "He knew exactly who you were, and he knew exactly what you would do when he was gone. He spent years building an ironclad fortress to protect me from you. He left you the logistics company because he knew your greed would blind you to the debt. My father left you exactly what you earned, Valerie. Debt, public ruin, and each other. I owe you absolutely nothing." I turned to the head of my security team, who was standing at attention a few feet away, with his hand resting on his radio. "Escort them out," I instructed firmly. "If they ever step foot on my property again, or if they try to contact my office, have them arrested for trespassing and harassment." The guards moved in immediately. They grabbed Valerie by the arms, hauling her up from the marble floor. She began to scream, a shrill and guttural sound of pure defeat. Jada scrambled to her feet, clutching her scuffed handbag, sobbing hysterically as the heavily armed guards marched them toward the heavy glass revolving doors. "You cannot do this to us!" Valerie shrieked, struggling uselessly against the security team as they pushed her forward. "We are family! We are family!" I stood in the center of the lobby, perfectly still, watching them get physically dragged out of my building. The heavy glass doors spun, pushing them out into the harsh Los Angeles sun. They stumbled onto the hot concrete sidewalk, 2 broken and destitute women, with absolutely nowhere to go. I turned my back on them, walked toward my private elevator, and pressed the button for the top floor. The purge was finally complete. 6 months later, the chaotic noise of my stepfamily's destruction had completely faded into absolute silence. The federal fraud investigations in Atlanta had resulted in Preston serving a lengthy prison sentence for wire fraud and forging corporate signatures. Valerie and Jada had vanished into the unforgiving reality of deep poverty, completely erased from the high society circles they had once desperately clung to. I never looked back. I stood on the rooftop of my commercial skyscraper, the cool Pacific breeze sweeping past me. The Los Angeles sun was setting, casting a brilliant and fiery orange and gold glow across the sprawling city skyline. The heavy Los Angeles traffic hummed far below a steady rhythm of life and ambition. I held a crystal glass of sparkling water, looking out over the empire I had built with my own two hands. This morning, I officially signed the legal paperwork to launch the Jeremiah Foundation. It is a multi-million-dollar scholarship and mentorship trust entirely dedicated to supporting young African American women entering the fiercely competitive world of commercial real estate. I funded it using the profits from my latest acquisitions. I created the foundation to honor the true legacy of my father, a man who believed in building undeniable wealth, maintaining absolute discretion, and always protecting your own. Through the foundation, I am ensuring that the next generation of ambitious Black women will never have to shrink themselves to fit into rooms where they are not respected. They will not have to endure fake diversity consulting offers from mediocre men like Preston. They will have the capital, the legal protection, and the strategic mentorship to buy the building instead of begging for a seat at the table. I took a slow breath of the crisp evening air. For years, Valerie and her golden child tried to convince me that I was a failure. They tried to paint me as the difficult and stubborn outcast who threw her life away because I refused to play their toxic status-obsessed games. They wanted me to be the scapegoat so they could feel superior. They wanted me to break under the weight of their constant microaggressions. But toxic people always make one fatal miscalculation. They underestimate the quiet ones. They underestimate the people who walk away instead of engaging in their petty and dramatic screaming matches. They confuse silence with weakness, completely unaware that while they are loudly bragging about borrowed money, we are quietly building fortresses out of solid stone. My father taught me that true power never has to shout. True power is letting your enemies talk themselves into a corner. True power is knowing your exact worth and absolutely refusing to offer a discount to people who cannot afford you. I did not need to scream at my stepmother in that Atlanta foyer. I did not need to throw a drink in Preston's face in the parking garage. I just needed to let their own greed, their own arrogance, and their own blinding narcissism do the heavy lifting. I gave them the rope, and they eagerly built their own gallows. I looked down at the vintage emerald ring sparkling on my finger, the only physical piece of my biological mother I had left. It reminded me of where I came from, and the Los Angeles skyline stretched out before me reminded me of exactly where I was going. I am Kendra. I am 35 years old. I survived the toxic manipulation of a family that tried to bury me. I took their strongest hits, I walked away without a single scratch, and I turned my father's secret war chest into a generational empire. I raised my glass to the setting sun, offering a silent toast to the man who taught me how to play the long game. The evening sky deepened into a rich and dark purple, and the city lights began to spark to life across the grid. I stood on the roof of my own skyscraper, surrounded by the quiet and magnificent hum of success. I am free, I am wealthy, and I am utterly untouchable.